Hey there, welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we step into the world of Paul Castellano. Some knew him as Big Paul, others the Howard Hughes of the Mafia. But in the end, the world remembered him as the White House Don, a man who built his empire in boardrooms instead of back alleys, only to be cut down in a storm of bullets outside Spark Steakhouse. It's a story of power, betrayal, and a cold December night in New York that changed the Mafia forever. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it for you? It's always surreal watching this little underworld of ours stretch across time zones and continents. And hey, if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We've got more shadows to explore, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. All right, settle in. Let the noise of the day slip away, and follow me into the shadows. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Prologue, the executioner's shadow. The barber shop was quiet. The hum of a single electric razor buzzed in the background, the sound steady, almost soothing. It was late morning on October 25, 1957, and Albert Anastasia, one of the most feared men in the American underworld, sat in a red leather chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. A white towel draped around his shoulders. He leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the barber's scissors trim around his ears. For once, his hands were still. For once, the executioner had allowed himself to relax. But in the underworld, moments of peace are only illusions. The door creaked open. Two men stepped inside. Their faces were calm, unremarkable, forgettable in a way that only killers can be when they need to vanish back into the crowd. They didn't wait. Guns were already drawn, cold steel glinting in the fluorescent lights. The first shot shattered the silence. Then another, and another. Bullets tore through mirrors, glass exploding across the floor. The barber ducked, screaming, his hands trembling as he dropped the scissors. Anastasia's eyes widened, and for the briefest second, the man known as the Lord High Executioner didn't look like the Mafia's most terrifying killer. He looked human, vulnerable, betrayed. He tried to rise, confused, dazed, blood already soaking into the towel around his neck. He reached out, hands grasping for the gunman's reflections in the mirrors, swinging at phantoms as bullets slammed into his chest. By the time his body hit the floor, the empire he had built on fear, blood, and violence collapsed with him. The men vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Their footsteps faded, leaving only the smell of gunpowder and the image of a Mafia boss sprawled on the barbershop floor, crimson spilling onto the white tiles like paint across a blank canvas. And so ended the life of Albert Anastasia. But to understand how he died like this, you have to understand how he lived. Because this was no ordinary gangster. He wasn't just another name in the long, bloody history of the American Mafia. He was the hand of death itself, the man trusted by the Mafia to carry out its darkest work. Some called him ruthless. Others called him insane. But most just called him what he was, the executioner. So how does a poor immigrant boy from the docks of Brooklyn become the most feared killer in America? How does a man go from obscurity to shaping the Mafia's deadliest chapter? And why did his life end in a storm of bullets inside a Manhattan barbershop? That story begins decades earlier, long before the world knew the name Anastasia. Albert was born Alberto Anastasia in a small Italian town in 1902. Poverty wasn't a stranger, it was the only life he knew. Hunger gnawed at him from childhood, carving something into his soul that never healed. By the time he was a teenager, he had crossed the Atlantic, like millions of other immigrants, chasing the dream of America. But for Albert, that dream was different. It wasn't about hard work or honest living. It was about power. It was about never being hungry again. On the Brooklyn docks, he found work. Hard labor, endless hours, the kind of life that broke men in half. But Albert didn't just work. He fought. And when he fought, he didn't stop until the other man couldn't get up. The docks were rough, controlled by gangs and racketeers, and Albert's fists became his ticket out of obscurity. But fists alone weren't enough. Violence was currency, And Albert understood early that the more ruthless you were, the higher you could climb. His temper was legendary even in those early years. A wrong word, a careless insult, and Albert's rage would explode without warning. He was arrested more than once for murder, accused of killing men who crossed him. But witnesses vanished. Evidence crumbled. Each time, Albert walked free. To the cops, he was a ghost. To the men on the street, he was something else entirely. A storm in human form. Unpredictable, terrifying, unstoppable. By the late 1920s, Albert had found his way into the company of men who saw in him not just a brawler, but a weapon. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, men who were rewriting the rules of the Mafia, transforming a loose collection of gangs into something bigger, something structured. And in Albert Anastasia, they found the perfect enforcer. Luciano's vision needed muscle. It needed fear. It needed someone willing to do what others would hesitate to even imagine. That someone was Albert. He became part of the engine behind what would soon be called Murder, Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. If you think of organized crime like a corporation, then Murder Incorporated was its human resources department. Except their job wasn't hiring and firing. It was killing. Whenever a mob boss needed someone eliminated, whether in New York, Chicago, or anywhere else, they turned to Murder Incorporated. And at the top of that machine, looming like a shadow over the streets, was Albert Anastasia. He didn't just pull the trigger himself, though he often did. He oversaw it. He organized it. He approved it. He was the judge, jury, and executioner rolled into one. That's how he earned his title, the Lord High Executioner. And Albert reveled in it. He didn't shy away from the blood. In fact, some say he enjoyed it too much. Killers whispered that he would laugh as a man begged for his life, that his eyes would light up when the job was done. He wasn't just feared, he was mythologized. A boogeyman in flesh and bone. But power like that doesn't come without enemies. By the 1940s and 50s, Albert had risen to the very top of the Mafia pyramid. He commanded the loyalty of men, controlled unions, and sat at the right hand of Frank Costello, the so-called prime minister of the underworld. The docks of New York bent to his will. He was rich. He was untouchable, or so he believed. And yet, beneath the surface, cracks began to form. The very men who once relied on him began to fear him. His unpredictability, his hair-trigger temper, his taste for blood, it all made him dangerous not just to his enemies, but to his own friends. In the Mafia, loyalty is currency. But when loyalty is poisoned by fear, it becomes fragile. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. Vito Genovese, hungry for power, saw Albert as an obstacle. Carlo Gambino, his own underboss, eyed the throne. Costello himself, weary and aging, was no longer the shield he once was. Albert was powerful, yes, but he was also isolated. And isolation in the Mafia is the first sign that death is near. Which brings us back to that October morning. The Park Sheraton Hotel, the barber shop, the red leather chair. Albert had survived wars, power struggles, betrayals. He had killed without hesitation, built his life on blood and iron. But in the end, it all unraveled in less than a minute. Two men, faceless and calm, reduced the Lord High Executioner to another statistic in the long, bloody history of organized crime. The world gasped. Newspapers splashed his death across front pages. How could a man so feared, so untouchable, be struck down so publicly, so brutally? The answer lies not just in the bullets that killed him, but in the path that led him there. Because Albert Anastasia wasn't just a gangster. He was a reflection of the very thing that made the Mafia powerful, its ability to terrify, to control, to kill without conscience. But he was also a reflection of its weakness, its endless betrayals, its hunger for power, its inability to trust even its own. The barbershop hit was the climax of a life spent in shadows, but the story of how he got there, of how a boy from Calabria became the Mafia's most feared executioner, still lingers like gun smoke in the air. And that's where our story begins. This is not just the tale of Albert Anastasia's death. It's the story of his rise, his reign, and the violent legacy he left behind. A legacy written not in ink, but in blood. And if you think you already know how dark this story goes, think again. Because the shadows he cast are longer than you can imagine. Chapter 1. From Calabria to Brooklyn, 1902-1920s. The boy was barely 8 years old when he first learned that survival could be crueler than death. Calabria in the early 1900s was not the Italy of romance novels and postcard beaches. It was a land of jagged mountains, stubborn soil, and hunger that gnawed at stomachs like rats in a cellar. Families woke before dawn not to chase dreams, but to chase scraps, bread, beans, anything that could keep the children alive one more day. In one such family, a child named Umberto Anastasia, later known as Albert, grew up with hunger as both enemy and teacher. The streets of Tropea, his hometown, were narrow veins cut through stone, but to a child they felt like a prison. Old men whispered about America as if it were heaven itself, a place where streets glittered with gold and no one went hungry. To little Umberto, those stories weren't just bedtime tales, they were lifelines. Each word painted a future where he didn't have to fight over crumbs, where his fists didn't need to be clenched before breakfast. But before America, there was violence. Even as a boy, Umberto had a temper that boiled like the Calabrian sun. When another child mocked his tattered shoes, Umberto's fists answered before his mouth could. He was small, but his fury was volcanic. Each fight carved something into him. A belief that pain was the only language men truly respected. That belief would follow him across an ocean. By the time he was 15, that ocean came calling. Millions were leaving Italy then, flooding into ships bound for Ellis Island. Poverty pushed them out, and hope pulled them in. For Umberto, the decision was as natural as breathing. There was no future in Calabria, but hunger and dust. With his brothers beside him, he boarded a ship cramped with families whose eyes carried both fear and desperate ambition. The Atlantic stretched endless and gray, the waves rough, but nothing felt more dangerous than staying behind. When the ship docked in New York, the city did not welcome him with golden streets. The smell was harsh, coal smoke, sewage, fish rotting on docks. The air was alive with shouting in a dozen languages, a chorus of survival. The Lower East Side was a jungle, and the predators were not lions, but landlords, bosses, and gangs. The Anastasia brothers became dock workers in Brooklyn. The docks were brutal places, where men's bodies bent under crates of cargo, where accidents crushed bones, and where gangsters controlled who worked and who starved. The docks were not run by unions in the fair sense. They were controlled by men with fists, knives, and guns. To get work, you paid tribute. To keep work, you kept quiet. For a young immigrant like Albert, it was a crash course in power. He started as a laborer, his shoulders straining under heavy loads. The water smelled of salt and oil, the planks slick beneath his boots. But when fights broke out, and fights always broke out, Albert didn't back away. He leapt in, fists flying, his eyes blazing. The older men noticed. Violence was more valuable than muscle. Anyone could haul a crate, but not everyone could strike fear with a single glare. By 17, Albert had already caught the eye of the wrong people, or the right ones, depending on how you looked at it. Street bosses noticed that this wiry dock worker fought not just to win, but to destroy. He didn't stop when his opponent fell. He didn't stop when blood stained his hands. He only stopped when the other man didn't move. That kind of ferocity couldn't be taught. It could only be harnessed. Then came the first murder charge. The year was 1921. The details remain clouded, but the story that lingered was simple. Albert killed a fellow dock worker in a fit of rage. He was arrested, thrown into a cell, facing the kind of sentence that would bury him before his life truly began. But fate, or perhaps the Mafia's unseen hand, intervened. Witnesses changed their stories. Some simply vanished. Without them, the case collapsed. Albert walked free. To the police, it was a failure of the system. To Albert, it was proof. Proof that violence could be erased if you had the right friends. Proof that he was destined for more than a laborer's life. But freedom didn't calm him. It emboldened him. His temper grew wilder, his willingness to use his fists more reckless. The docks became his training ground, each fight another rehearsal for the violence he would one day unleash on a larger stage. Men whispered about him in the bars along the waterfront. Some said he was cursed, born with death in his blood. Others said he was blessed, protected by something no court could touch. Whatever it was, no one doubted that young Anastasia was dangerous. His reputation spread beyond the docks. In neighborhoods where Italian gangs vied for power, his name carried weight. To some, he was an asset, a weapon you could point at your enemies. To others, he was a problem, unpredictable and uncontrollable. But to Albert, it was simple. Fear was currency, and he was rich. Yet fear is a double-edged blade. For every man who admired his ruthlessness, another man watched him with suspicion. Trust is fragile when it's built on blood. But Albert never worried. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had already stared down prison bars and walked away untouched. By the early 1920s, the Mafia in New York was evolving. Old-world bosses clung to tradition, while younger men like Lucky Luciano dreamed of a syndicate that was bigger than any one neighborhood. To build it, they needed soldiers, men who would not hesitate, men who could kill without flinching. Albert fit that mold perfectly. But at this stage, he wasn't yet a boss. He was a foot soldier with a reputation, still living in cramped apartments, still pulling shifts on the docks when work came. Nights were spent in smoky backrooms, where gamblers threw dice and whispers of bootlegging fortunes filled the air. Prohibition had turned alcohol into liquid gold, and gangs were scrambling to seize control. The money was endless, but so was the blood. For Albert, it was opportunity. Violence was suddenly more valuable than ever, and he had it in spades. What made Albert different from other street toughs wasn't just his temper, it was his certainty. When others hesitated before pulling a knife, he didn't. When others doubted whether a man should live or die, Albert already knew the answer. That decisiveness, that cold clarity, made him indispensable. He wasn't just a brawler anymore. He was becoming a killer. Still, the immigrant boy inside him never fully disappeared. In rare moments of quiet, perhaps when the Brooklyn wind carried the smell of the sea, he might have remembered Calabria, the hunger, the dust, the hopelessness. America had promised gold and delivered blood, but Albert was no longer chasing the dream of streets paved in riches. He was chasing something darker, respect born of fear, immortality carved into the shadows of men's hearts. Every empire starts small. For Albert Anastasia, it began with dockside fights and a murder charge that slipped away like smoke. It began with hunger, so sharp it forged steel in his soul. It began with fists that learned early that mercy had no place in survival. And it would not be long before bigger men with bigger plans came knocking. Because in the Mafia, killers are never unemployed for long. Albert's story was only just beginning. But beginnings carry their own dangers. Because when a man discovers his greatest talent is taking life, the question becomes simple and terrifying. How far will he go to prove it? Chapter 2. A Taste for Blood. The night was heavy with fog, the kind that clung to the Brooklyn waterfront like a shroud. Men finished their shifts on the docks, their shoulders sore, their pay slim, their tempers raw. It was in places like this, where desperation and pride collided, that violence became almost inevitable. And it was here, in the early 1920s, that Albert Anastasia's name first bled into police reports for something darker than fists. The story begins with a killing. The details are blurred, scattered across old newspapers and whispered memories, but the heart of it remains unchanged. A man was found dead, and Albert was accused of being the hand that silenced him. Witnesses claimed it happened after an argument on the docks, maybe over work, maybe over money. Others swore it was more personal, a slight that Albert couldn't let pass. What everyone agreed on was this: when the dust settled, Albert was the one standing. He was arrested, hauled into a cell that smelled of iron and stale sweat, staring at bars that seemed to close around him like the jaws of a trap. For most men, a murder charge at 18 would be the end of the story. Prison would swallow them whole, their names forgotten before the ink on their mugshot dried. But Albert was not most men. Even then, There was something uncanny about him, something that made people hesitate. The police thought they had him, but the case began to unravel almost immediately. Witnesses who claimed to have seen the killing suddenly couldn't remember. Others disappeared, vanishing into the night as if swallowed by the city itself. Without testimony, the prosecution had nothing. The charges collapsed, and Albert walked out a free man. For the law, it was a failure. For Albert, it was a revelation. Violence was not just survival. It was a tool, a weapon he could wield with impunity. If the system couldn't stop him once, why should he fear it ever again? And so his reputation began to grow, not as a worker, not even as a brawler, but as something more dangerous. On the docks, men started to lower their voices when his name came up. It wasn't just that he was violent. It was that he seemed untouchable. The nickname hadn't yet come. Lord High Executioner was still decades away, but the seeds were already planted. Albert had tasted blood, and he had learned the lesson that would define his life. Killing could erase problems faster than fists ever could. Yet behind that lesson was something deeper, something more personal. Albert wasn't a calculating strategist in these early years. He wasn't sitting in backrooms plotting moves like a chess master. He was young, hot-blooded, and explosive. His violence was emotional, impulsive, like a storm that broke without warning. Dock workers remembered him flying into rages over the smallest slights. A man who pushed ahead in line. A comment about his accent. Even a glance that lingered too long. Each insult was met with fists, knives, or worse. He had no patience for humiliation, no tolerance for weakness, not in others, and certainly not in himself. In the rough hierarchy of the waterfront, that made him both respected and feared. But there was also a strange kind of admiration. Men who labored for pennies looked at Albert and saw someone unafraid to strike back. He embodied the rage they swallowed each day, the anger at bosses, gangsters, and a city that seemed designed to grind them down. He was reckless, yes, but he was also defiant. In a world where survival often meant keeping your head low, Albert raised his high, daring anyone to knock it down. The newspapers of the time didn't dwell on him. He was just another immigrant kid with blood on his hands, lost in the blur of crime blotters. But in the underworld, stories spread faster than ink. Word reached men higher up, men who understood that raw violence, if controlled, could be more profitable than dangerous. Albert was not yet a soldier in their ranks, but he was becoming visible. And visibility in that world was never accidental. Each fight, each rumor, each whispered warning about his temper added bricks to the reputation he was building. By the mid-1920s, Albert was no longer just another face in the crowd of dock workers. He was a name, a presence, the kind of man who walked into a bar and silenced conversations with his shadow alone. The arrest for murder had done something else, too. It had marked him in the eyes of the law. Detectives remembered him. His file lingered in cabinets, his face etched into the minds of men sworn to uphold order. They might not have had the evidence then, but they knew. And Albert knew they knew. It created a tension, a dance of recognition. Every time a body turned up, every time blood stained the docks, his name surfaced like oil on water. For most men, that kind of scrutiny would be a curse. For Albert, it was a crown. Each suspicion only fed the legend. Each accusation that went unproven made him seem more invincible. He wasn't just a dock worker anymore. He was a figure to be feared. And fear was its own kind of power. Think of fear as a shadow. It grows larger than the man who casts it, stretching into places he hasn't even stepped yet. Albert's shadow spread across Brooklyn in those years, reaching into neighborhoods where men who had never met him still whispered about his fury. That shadow became his calling card, and it opened doors that fists alone never could. Yet power built on fear is unstable. It makes allies cautious and enemies restless. Already, in those early days, men who might have been friends kept their distance. They saw in Albert not just strength, but danger, the kind of danger that could erupt at any moment, consuming anyone too close. But Albert didn't see it that way. To him, each fight, each arrest, each rumor was proof that he was destined for more. He wasn't content to be a laborer, scraping by. He had discovered his talent, and it was a dark one. Killing didn't just solve problems, it created opportunity. And he was ready for more. The first taste of blood is always the most dangerous. For Albert, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about identity. He was no longer Umberto the immigrant boy or Albert the dock worker. He was something else, something sharper, something harder. Violence was not just an action. It was who he was. But the underworld is never kind to men who rise too quickly. Each step forward comes with eyes watching, measuring, waiting. Albert was still young, still raw. And as much as his reputation grew, so did the risks. The law hadn't caged him. The streets hadn't beaten him. But fate, as always, had its own plans. And the next time Albert's name crossed paths with death, it would not be in the shadows of the docks. It would be in the heart of the Mafia's evolution, where violence wasn't just rage, it was business. Because men like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky were already reshaping the future of organized crime. They needed soldiers who could kill without hesitation. And Albert Anastasia, with his taste for blood, was about to become exactly the kind of man they were looking for. The dockside brawls were only the beginning. The real killing was yet to come. Chapter 3: The Dockside Enforcer. The sound of waves slapping against the pilings mixed with the metallic clang of cargo being dropped on wooden docks. It was morning in Brooklyn, the kind of morning that carried the smell of salt water, oil, and sweat. Men lined up for work, caps pulled low, eyes hollow with exhaustion. They weren't just waiting for wages. They were waiting for permission. On the waterfront, who labored and who starved wasn't decided by bosses and offices. It was decided by men with fists, knives, and guns. And in the 1920s, one of those men was Albert Anastasia. Picture him there, not yet the legend he would become, but already something more than the rest. He stood differently, shoulders squared, eyes cold, a presence that bent the air around him. If another man stepped out of line, Albert corrected him not with words, but with violence. And slowly, the Brooklyn docks became his proving ground, the stage where he transformed from a dock worker into an enforcer. Labor racketeering might sound like business jargon, but in reality, it was a brutal kind of extortion. Think of it this way: workers needed jobs, bosses needed labor, and gangsters stood in between, charging a toll in blood and money. Control the docks, and you controlled a river of cash flowing through the city. It wasn't just about moving crates of coffee or barrels of whiskey. It was about owning the men who moved them. And to own men, you needed fear. Albert was perfect for this role. He didn't just threaten, he delivered. When a worker resisted paying kickbacks or challenged the mob's authority, Albert made sure that man didn't challenge anyone again. Sometimes it was a beating so savage the victim limped for months. Other times it was worse, whispered stories of men who walked into the night and never returned. Each act deepened his legend. Each act tightened the mob's grip. What set Albert apart wasn't just his brutality. It was the way he seemed to embody it, as though violence was stitched into his very skin. Other enforcers sometimes hesitated, calculating the cost of each strike. Albert didn't hesitate. He moved like a predator, instinctual and merciless. Men who saw him work said he had a look in his eyes, a gleam that made you believe he wasn't just doing a job, he was doing what he loved. But even predators have purpose. For Albert, enforcing on the docks wasn't random rage. It was business. Each beating, each killing was an investment. Every time he silenced resistance, he strengthened the mob's monopoly on labor. Ships couldn't unload without their approval. Cargo couldn't move without their cut. And with prohibition fueling demand for smuggling, the docks became even more valuable. Whiskey and rum didn't just vanish into thin air, they flowed through the piers. To control that, you needed a man like Albert standing watch. Yet there was more than money in his ambition. Deep down, Albert understood something fundamental. Reputation was power. A man who feared you would pay you. A man who admired you would follow you. And a man who underestimated you would end up in the ground. On the waterfront, Albert wasn't just feared. He was respected, the kind of respect born not from kindness, but from inevitability. He was the storm you couldn't avoid. But with power came attention. Dock workers whispered his name. Police noticed his pattern, and higher-ranking mobsters saw him for what he truly was, a weapon too sharp to ignore. Luciano's vision of a modern mafia required men like Albert. They needed killers who could keep unions in line, break strikes when necessary, or enforce silence when whispers of betrayal grew too loud. The future mob was being built not just in smoky backrooms, but on piers where men like Albert wrote the rules in blood. Still, his rise wasn't without friction. Some dock bosses feared him. They saw his temper as a liability, worried that his uncontrollable rages could draw heat from the police. Others tried to challenge him, to remind him that he was still just one man. But Albert dealt with challengers the way he dealt with everything, decisively, violently. Stories spread of fights where he didn't stop until the floor was slick with blood. One tale had him hurling a man into the freezing East River, watching him sink, while others stood frozen on the pier. Whether the story was true or exaggerated didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed it. Fear worked faster than rumor. And soon, Albert wasn't just an enforcer. He was an institution. Men came to the docks not just to work, but to avoid his wrath. They paid their cuts, kept their heads down, and hoped his gaze never landed on them. And when it did, when he fixed those cold eyes on you, it felt like being pinned under the weight of something immovable. But beneath that aura of terror was still the young immigrant who once felt hunger gnaw at his belly. The boy from Calabria who crossed an ocean with nothing now stood at the center of a world where everything was for the taking. For the first time, he had real power. And power, once tasted, is never forgotten. Yet, power built on fear is fragile. Police raids grew more frequent. Detectives, already suspicious after his murder arrest, began circling him like sharks. They couldn't pin charges on him. Witnesses remained silent or disappeared. But they remembered. They always remembered. And every time a body turned up on the docks, Albert's name echoed in their minds. For Albert, this scrutiny wasn't a warning. It was a challenge. Each time he walked free, each time the law failed to cage him, his confidence grew. To him, it was proof that he was untouchable, that fate itself was on his side. He began to carry himself not like a laborer or even an enforcer, but like a man destined for more. The transition was subtle but undeniable. He wasn't just breaking bones anymore. He was shaping the future of organized crime. Unions bent to him. Smuggling routes relied on him. And higher bosses began inviting him into meetings, treating him not as muscle, but as a man of influence. In less than a decade, he had gone from a hungry boy on a dock to a name that carried weight in Mafia circles. And yet, beneath the rise, danger lurked. Violence had propelled him upward, but violence also painted targets on his back. Other gangsters resented his growing clout. Some feared he was too reckless. Others envied his reputation. In the Mafia, envy was often deadlier than bullets. Albert, of course, didn't care. He thrived in the danger, almost seemed to need it. To him, each fight, each threat, each accusation was fuel. He didn't flinch when enemies circled. He welcomed it. Because he knew something they didn't, that he wasn't finished climbing. The docks were just the beginning. And somewhere in the backrooms of New York, bigger plans were being drawn. Plans that would transform the Mafia from scattered gangs into a national syndicate. Plans that required men who could enforce rules without hesitation, who could kill without conscience. Albert Anastasia was already that man. The waterfront had made him, but the syndicate was waiting to claim him. And once it did, the violence of the docks would seem like a prelude to something far darker. Because soon, Albert wouldn't just be enforcing. He would be executing. And the world would learn his name not as a dockside thug, but as the man they called the Lord High Executioner. Chapter 4. Alliance with Lucky Luciano. The smoke in the backroom was thick, curling in lazy spirals under a single yellow bulb. Glasses clinked, low voices murmured, and in the corner, Albert Anastasia leaned back in his chair, his eyes unblinking. Across the table sat men whose names already carried weight in the underworld. Men like Charles, Lucky, Luciano, and Frank Costello. They weren't dock bosses or neighborhood thugs. They were architects, drawing up blueprints for a new kind of mafia. And here was Albert, the boy from Calabria, the dockside enforcer, suddenly sharing their air. It wasn't chance that put him there. Violence had carved his path, but violence alone wasn't enough. He had been noticed. Luciano was a visionary, ruthless but pragmatic, always searching for talent. He knew that building an empire wasn't just about alliances and money. It was about having soldiers who would enforce rules without hesitation. Soldiers who could scare men into obedience. Soldiers like Albert. The meeting was quiet, but the air was charged with unspoken truths. Prohibition had turned liquor into gold. Smuggling routes were rivers of profit, and every gang wanted its share. But with profit came chaos. Old bosses clung to tradition, demanding respect for rules imported from Sicily. Younger men, like Luciano, saw tradition as chains holding back progress. They wanted a syndicate, a commission, a structure that turned gangs into something resembling a corporation. And for that dream to work, there had to be enforcement, brutal, efficient, unquestionable. Albert didn't speak much that night. He didn't need to. His reputation had walked in before him. Whispers of bodies left on docks, of men silenced with knives and bullets, had preceded him into the room. To Luciano and Costello, that was enough. Here was a man who could be trusted not with secrets, but with action. Frank Costello, calm and smooth, saw in Albert the perfect counterweight to his own world of politics and influence. Costello dealt with judges, senators, and mayors, greasing palms with quiet charm. But every politician had a constituency, and every constituency needed fear. That's where Albert fit in. He didn't whine and dine power. He enforced it. He was the dark shadow that made Costello's light possible. Luciano, meanwhile, saw something even larger. He was already maneuvering against his enemies, men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, whose grip on the old Mafia order was suffocating. To break them, Luciano needed more than strategy. He needed executioners. Albert wasn't just another trigger man. He was an enforcer who inspired dread, a man who could carry out orders with an almost theatrical brutality that sent messages louder than words. The bond that formed wasn't friendship. Men like Luciano and Anastasia didn't trade trust the way ordinary people did. Their bond was forged in necessity, welded by ambition, and sealed with blood. Luciano needed killers. Albert needed opportunity. Together, they found both. By the mid-1920s, Albert's role expanded. He wasn't confined to the docks anymore. He was part of a larger machine, the syndicate that Luciano and his allies were building. When someone needed to be reminded of their place, Albert delivered the reminder. When someone thought about betraying the cause, Albert made sure their thoughts never turned into actions. Each job added another brick to the legend, another reason men lowered their eyes when he entered a room. But beneath the efficiency, there was something else. Albert relished his work in a way that unnerved even his allies. For most mobsters, killing was business. For Albert, it sometimes looked like pleasure. Witnesses, few as they were, spoke of his unsettling calm after a hit, as if pulling a trigger or wielding a blade left him lighter, unburdened. To Luciano, this was valuable. To others, it was terrifying. And terror was exactly what Luciano needed. The Castellamarese War erupted at the turn of the decade, an all-out battle for control of New York's underworld. Streets turned red as factions aligned with Masuria and Maranzano hunted each other down. Luciano played both sides until the moment came to choose. And when he chose, men like Albert ensured his decision carried weight. Albert was there when Luciano orchestrated the murder of Joe Masuria in 1931, a killing that shifted the balance of power. He was part of the machinery that dismantled the old guard, making way for the syndicate. When Maranzano followed Masuria into the grave, the last barrier fell. Luciano emerged victorious, and at his side stood the men who had enforced his vision. Albert was one of them. This alliance elevated him in ways the docks never could. He wasn't just a thug anymore. He was an associate of the most powerful man in American organized crime. That kind of proximity was intoxicating. It meant influence. It meant money. It meant that the boy who once went hungry in Calabria now dined in the company of power. Yet, it also meant exposure. The higher he climbed, the more enemies he collected. Old-school bosses saw him as a brute elevated beyond his station. Rivals whispered about his temper, his unpredictability. Even allies sometimes wondered if his loyalty was to Luciano's vision or to his own thirst for violence. In the Mafia, doubt was as lethal as bullets. But Albert was undeterred. He had found his place, and he wasn't about to let it slip. Luciano gave orders, and Albert delivered results. Costello built political networks, and Albert ensured those networks stayed protected. His legend spread beyond New York, into Chicago, Detroit, even Cleveland. Murder wasn't just his trade, it was his signature. And that signature became part of the syndicate's strength. The alliance with Luciano also tied Albert to something larger, Murder, Incorporated. The name itself was chilling, whispered in bars and courtrooms, splashed across headlines in later years. It was the enforcement arm of the syndicate, a loose but efficient network of killers who handled the dirty work no boss wanted traced back to him. Albert didn't create it alone, but his influence within it was unmistakable. He was the shadow over its operations, the man whose reputation amplified its power. For every ambitious gangster who dreamed of climbing higher, there was the silent knowledge that Albert Anastasia might be waiting at the top of the stairs, pistol in hand. That kind of fear kept the Mafia's fragile peace intact. Luciano's commission could only function if rules were followed, and rules were only followed if men believed there were consequences. Albert was the embodiment of those consequences. And yet, he was still human. Beneath the title of enforcer, beneath the legend of brutality, there was a man who carried scars, some visible, others hidden. He remembered the hunger of Calabria, the humiliations of poverty, the scorn of men who once looked down on him. Every blow he struck, every life he ended, carried a piece of that past. In a way, he wasn't just killing rivals. He was killing the memory of the boy who once had nothing. Still, ambition is a hunger that never fades. With Luciano's star rising, Albert's grew brighter. But stars burn hottest just before they collapse. Luciano himself would soon face trial, prison, and exile. Costello would inherit part of his empire, steering the Mafia with politics rather than open war. And Albert, caught between them, would find himself at a crossroads. The alliance had given him power, reputation, and wealth. But it had also placed him in a game larger than he could control. Luciano was a master strategist, Costello a skilled diplomat. Albert was neither. He was the blade, not the hand that wielded it. And blades, no matter how sharp, are only useful as long as they remain in someone's grip. As the 1930s loomed, Albert stood on the threshold of something greater. He wasn't just enforcing anymore. He was part of the Mafia's core, its inner circle, its muscle and blood. The docks were behind him. The war had forged him. The alliance had crowned him. But the same question lingered, the same shadow that had followed him since his first killing. What happens when the executioner becomes too powerful, too feared, too uncontrollable? That question would hang over him like smoke. And soon, it would demand an answer. Chapter 5, The Hit Squad Forms. The orders were simple. A man had betrayed the syndicate, and his time was up. He didn't know it yet, but his fate had already been sealed in a quiet backroom meeting. 2 men would follow him, and when the moment came, they would end his life. His body would vanish, his name erased from the books, his story closed with the pull of a trigger. This was how business was conducted in the underworld. Silent, efficient, and final. But by the early 1930s, killings like these weren't random acts of vengeance anymore. They were part of a system, an organization built specifically for one purpose: murder. And at the center of it stood Albert Anastasia. The idea was born from necessity. With prohibition came money, and with money came chaos. The Mafia was growing faster than it could control itself. Old vendettas, new rivals, and ambitious underlings created a storm of potential betrayal. To maintain order, Luciano and his allies needed a mechanism of discipline, something beyond street brawls or personal grudges. They needed a centralized force, an enforcement arm for the entire syndicate. That force would come to be known by 2 chilling words: Murder, Incorporated. It wasn't an official name, not at first. It was a nickname given by journalists years later, but the essence was there from the start. A national hit squad, available to any boss across the country. Need a rival eliminated in Detroit? A disloyal soldier silenced in Chicago? A troublemaker dealt with in Brooklyn? You didn't need to send your own men, risking exposure or retaliation. You called on the squad. They handled it clean, and no one could trace it back to you. Albert Anastasia was the perfect man to shape this machine. He had already proved himself as the doc's ruthless enforcer, a man who could kill without hesitation and inspire terror just by walking into a room. But he wasn't alone. He found a partner in Louis Lepka Buckleter, a calculating figure from the Jewish mob. Where Albert brought raw violence, Lepka brought organization. Together, they transformed scattered killers into a structured unit. The partnership was unusual but effective. Albert, impulsive and ferocious, was the executioner who embodied fear. Lepka, cautious and methodical, was the businessman who turned murder into a commodity. One was the blade, the other the hand that guided it. And together, they built something that made the Mafia deadlier than ever before. Recruitment for the squad was simple. They wanted men who could kill without flinching, but also without ego. Professional killers, not hot-headed punks looking for glory. Many of them came from the Brooklyn neighborhoods where poverty and crime were the only education available. Irish, Jewish, Italian, it didn't matter. Loyalty wasn't to an ethnic gang or a neighborhood boss. Loyalty was to the squad, and through the squad, to the syndicate. The killers were paid not in respect or promises, but in cash. Each job was business. No vendettas, no personal grudges. Just a name, a price, and an order. That separation made the unit efficient. Killing wasn't an exception anymore. It was the rule. Albert oversaw much of the dirty work. He wasn't always the triggerman, but his presence loomed over the squad like a shadow. To the killers, he was the judge. He approved hits, organized logistics, and ensured the jobs were done with absolute finality. If a target was marked, that man's life was over, whether he knew it or not. Stories of the squad's efficiency spread quickly. Men who might have considered defying the syndicate now thought twice. The knowledge that an invisible force of executioners existed, waiting in the wings, was enough to silence dissent. It was fear weaponized, fear institutionalized. The Mafia had created not just a system of crime, but a system of death. Albert thrived in this role. The squad suited his temperament perfectly. Violence wasn't just an outlet anymore. It was a career. And he wore it like armor, his reputation expanding with every hit whispered about in bars and alleys. To law enforcement, his name became synonymous with the body count climbing across New York. To his allies, he was indispensable, the enforcer who kept the syndicate's foundation steady. But there was something more unsettling beneath it. For Albert, this wasn't just about business. Witnesses described how he seemed almost exhilarated by the work. Other mobsters killed with reluctance, or at least with the pragmatism of necessity. Albert, they said, carried a darker spark. He had grown up with hunger, rage, and humiliation, and now he had found an arena where those things weren't weaknesses, they were strengths. Each hit was both enforcement and expression. Each death confirmed his identity as the executioner. Lepka balanced him, reminding him that efficiency mattered as much as brutality. The syndicate couldn't afford unnecessary blood. Too much attention invited police and prosecutors, and too much chaos risked weakening the system they were building. Albert listened, but only up to a point. His temper was legendary, and even his allies walked carefully around it. In the underworld, loyalty was currency, but fear was still his language. The squad itself developed methods that became almost ritualistic. Sometimes the target vanished completely, his body dumped in a swamp or buried in a construction site. Other times the killings were theatrical, staged in broad daylight to send a message. Each approach was deliberate, calculated to maximize the desired effect. It was discipline through violence, order through blood. By the mid-1930s, Murder Incorporated had become the syndicate's most feared tool. Hundreds of killings were attributed to them, though exact numbers were impossible to pin down. To the outside world, it seemed like bodies were dropping everywhere. To the bosses, it was proof that the system worked. The squad was the glue holding the Mafia's fragile unity together. But every system built on fear carries a hidden weakness. The more efficient the killings became, the more attention they attracted. Newspapers picked up stories of mysterious murders. Prosecutors whispered about a hidden army of hitmen. Detectives, though frustrated, began connecting dots. And in the center of those whispers was always the same name, Albert Anastasia. Albert didn't care. Or if he did, he hid it well. To him, every suspicion, every headline, was a badge of honor. Each accusation that failed to stick only made him seem more invincible. He walked through the streets with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, the law powerless against him, his enemies too afraid to strike. But power built on murder is a dangerous thing. It binds men together, but it also isolates them. Even within the syndicate, some began to fear that Albert was becoming too comfortable in his role. A man who lives by the sword may one day turn it on his own allies. And whispers of his unpredictability began to spread. For the moment, though, his place was secure. Luciano trusted him. Costello valued him. Lepka relied on him. The syndicate needed him. And Albert basked in that need, knowing that as long as the Mafia required blood, he would never be without purpose. Still, the seeds of his future downfall were already planted. The very system he had helped create, the squad that made him powerful, was also a ticking clock. The law was watching, circling, waiting for a crack. And inside the Mafia, jealousy and ambition never rested. For now, Albert was the Lord High Executioner, though the title had not yet been spoken aloud. He was the embodiment of the syndicate's deadliest weapon. The hit squad had been formed, and it worked with terrifying precision. But in the shadows of its success lay a question no one wanted to voice. What happens when the man who enforces the rules begins to think he is above them? Chapter 6, Lord High Executioner. The man sat in a smoky Brooklyn bar, sipping whiskey, the rim of his glass trembling in his hands. He wasn't trembling from the cold or from drink. He was trembling because he knew he was marked. Someone had whispered it in his ear that morning. The syndicate was unhappy, his loyalty questioned. By nightfall, he would either clear his name or vanish from the earth. And as he stared into the amber liquid, he knew who would make that decision. Not a boss, not a judge, not even a friend. The one who decided was Albert Anastasia. By the mid-1930s, his name was more than just a name. It was a verdict. In a world where betrayal meant death, Anastasia wasn't simply another killer in the crowd. He was the man bosses trusted to handle the gravest decisions. If you broke the syndicate's rules, he was the shadow waiting at the end of the alley. If you threatened the fragile balance Luciano and Costello were building, he was the iron hand that restored order. It was during these years that a new title began to cling to him. Whispered first in bars, then shouted in headlines. It captured both the scope of his power and the terror it inspired. The Lord High Executioner. The name sounded medieval, like something torn from the pages of an old history book. And in a way, it fit perfectly. In the Dark Ages, executioners were figures of both dread and necessity. Men who did the killing that kings and courts demanded, but never wanted on their own hands. Society needed them, but no one wanted to stand too close. Anastasia was exactly that for the Mafia. He carried out the killings others ordered, but didn't dare perform. He was the one who swung the blade when justice, or what the mob called justice, was required. Under his supervision, Murder Incorporated reached its most terrifying heights. Prosecutors would later estimate that the squad was responsible for hundreds of killings, maybe as many as 700 across the country. The number was staggering, impossible for the public to comprehend. But within the Mafia, it wasn't the number that mattered, it was the certainty. Once Anastasia approved a job, there was no escaping it. The target could hide, beg, or even pray, but it didn't matter. The end would come. The system worked like clockwork. A boss in Chicago or Cleveland would reach out quietly, often through coded language or trusted messengers. A problem needed solving. A man needed erasing. Albert would hear the details, decide if the cause was just, and then pass the assignment down. The killers beneath him, efficient and silent, carried it out. By the time the newspapers printed another story about a man found in a ditch or slumped in his car, Albert was already moving on to the next name. To the men under him, he was both feared and revered. They called him Tough Tony in private sometimes, or simply the executioner. They knew he had their backs if they did their jobs, but they also knew his temper could snap like a live wire. There were stories, some true, some legend, of him killing men himself when he felt the need to send a louder message. One tale told of a hit gone sloppy, the target still breathing when Albert arrived to check. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger himself, ensuring the job was finished. The killers watched, silent, realizing they weren't just employees. They were apprentices standing in the shadow of something larger. But Albert wasn't just a killer. He was a presence. Courtroom sketches of him during later years show a man with a thick jaw, cold eyes, and the kind of stillness that unnerves even when no words are spoken. In meetings, he rarely wasted time on speeches. His silence carried its own weight. And when he did speak, his voice cut through smoke and chatter like a blade, blunt and final. What made him terrifying wasn't just his willingness to kill. It was the unpredictability. He could be charming in one moment, laughing with friends, and then in a split second his mood would change and violence would erupt. Men who worked alongside him learned to watch his face carefully, to gauge the storm before it broke. One wrong word, one careless glance, and you could become another lesson in why the Lord High Executioner was a title well earned. The press ate it up. By the late 1930s, headlines painted him as the bogeyman of organized crime, the embodiment of Mafia violence. Some articles exaggerated, some sensationalized, but all carried the same truth. Albert Anastasia was the man behind the curtain, the one who made sure the syndicate's rules were obeyed. Parents in Brooklyn warned their kids not to speak his name too loudly, as if invoking it might draw his attention. Law enforcement knew his reputation too, but proving it was another matter. They suspected him in dozens of killings. Detectives followed him, prosecutors whispered about building cases, but time after time the evidence fell apart. Witnesses disappeared, juries hesitated, and police files grew thick with rumors instead of convictions. Each failure only strengthened his legend. It was as if the law itself bent around him, unable to pin him down. To the public, he was a ghost. To the Mafia, he was indispensable. But being indispensable comes at a cost. The more powerful Anastasia became, the more isolated he grew. The same men who once praised his loyalty began to fear his unpredictability. His violence, once a tool, now looked like a threat. And in the delicate balance of the Mafia, too much fear could be as dangerous as too little. Still, for Albert, this was his prime. He had risen from the hunger of Calabria, from the grime of Brooklyn docks, to stand at the center of the syndicate's deadliest arm. He wasn't just a participant in the Mafia's wars. He was the executioner of its will. And he carried the title proudly, as though it were both burden and crown. What did that do to a man's soul? Did he ever lie awake at night, haunted by the faces of the men whose lives he ended? Or did he sleep soundly, certain that each killing was justified by the code he served? We can only speculate. But one thing is certain. His identity was no longer Albert the boy or Anastasia the dockworker. He was the Lord High Executioner, the man who embodied death itself in the American underworld. And yet, the same shadow that made him powerful also made him vulnerable. The more hits he oversaw, the more bodies that fell under his watch, the more the world took notice. Prosecutors in New York began whispering of trials, of witnesses ready to speak. Rivals within the Mafia watched, their envy mixing with calculation. They knew that even executioners can bleed, and that one day the blade he swung for others might swing back toward him. For now, though, the legend grew. Each hit was another brick in his fortress of fear, each headline another nail in his myth. And the name, Lord High Executioner, echoed louder, spreading beyond Brooklyn, beyond New York, until it seemed to stretch across the country itself. But legends are fragile things. They glow brightest just before the fall. And even as Anastasia basked in the power of his title, forces were already gathering against him. Forces both inside the Mafia and outside. men in suits and men with badges, waiting for their chance. The Lord High Executioner had built his empire on blood. But blood has a way of staining everything it touches. And the question lingered like smoke in a backroom. When the man who decides life and death becomes too powerful, who decides his? Chapter 7. Blood rules the streets. The scream of brakes echoed down a Brooklyn block, a car pulling to a sudden stop in the night. Two men leapt out, their pistols already raised. They didn't shout warnings. They didn't demand anything. They simply opened fire, bullets tearing into the man standing on the curb. Neighbors ducked behind doors. The smell of cordite filled the air. By the time the shooters drove away, the victim lay bleeding on the pavement, his life snuffed out as casually as if a cigarette had been crushed underfoot. This wasn't random. Nothing in Albert Anastasia's world was random. It was a message, and the message was clear. Betrayal, hesitation, even the hint of disobedience would be answered in blood. By the mid-1930s, the streets of New York were drenched in a climate of fear. Ordinary citizens whispered about the Mafia in hushed tones, but inside that world, the whispers grew even darker. Men lived with the knowledge that their lives could end at any moment, decided not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in smoke-filled backrooms where the Lord High Executioner gave a quiet nod. Albert oversaw methods of killing that were as varied as they were ruthless. Some were quick, a single bullet to the back of the head, the victim slumping forward before he even realized he was dead. Others were theatrical, designed not just to eliminate but to warn. A body left in a car with the engine running. A man found beaten and stabbed, dumped where his friends would discover him. Each method was a language of its own, tailored to the message Albert wanted to send. In the underworld, murder wasn't only punishment. It was communication. Like punctuation in a sentence, it marked the end of arguments, the silencing of disputes. When the syndicate needed to make a point, Albert made it with bullets and blades. And every man who walked those streets understood the grammar of violence. The killers who worked under him perfected their craft. Strangulation was one method, brutal and intimate. It left no gunshot echo to alert the neighbors, no shell casings for police to find. Ice picks were another favorite, silent, efficient, leaving wounds that spoke of both precision and cruelty. Guns were common, of course, but always used with purpose. A daytime shooting in the open was designed to terrify, to remind everyone watching that the Mafia didn't fear visibility. One story told of a hit carried out in a crowded bar. The target was drinking, laughing, unaware. The shooters walked in, put bullets in his chest, and walked out again while the entire room froze in silence. No one screamed. No one ran to help. No one spoke to the police afterward. Fear held every tongue still. That was Albert's true power. Not the act of killing, but the silence it created afterward. People often ask how one man could oversee so many murders. The truth is, Albert didn't need to pull the trigger every time. His reputation did much of the work for him. Like a dark cloud hanging over the city, his name was enough to paralyze men with dread. To know that Anastasia was involved was to know the outcome was already written. It wasn't a question of if, it was only a matter of when. That inevitability shaped the streets. Men paid their dues without argument. Union leaders signed deals without protest. Politicians, when approached by Costello's men, remembered the shadow of Anastasia standing behind the request. His violence wasn't just physical, it was psychological. He turned the entire city into an accomplice through fear. And yet, there was something almost ritualistic about the way the killings unfolded. A man would be accused of betrayal. The bosses would deliberate. And when the decision was made, the order flowed downward like a chain of command in the military. At the bottom of that chain stood the Killers of Murder Incorporated. But at the top, watching with cold eyes, was Albert. His approval was the seal that made a death official. For the men marked for execution, the final hours must have been torture. Imagine living with the knowledge that your name had been whispered in one of those meetings, that your fate had already been decided. You might eat your last meal, kiss your children, lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, waiting for footsteps on the stairs. And when the moment finally came, When the knock rattled your door or the car slowed beside you on a dark street, you knew there was no bargaining left. The Lord High Executioner had spoken, but fear cuts both ways. For the killers themselves, there was always the gnawing realization that they, too, could end up on the list. Loyalty in the Mafia was fragile, and ambition often turned allies into threats. Some of the very men who carried out Albert's orders knew that one mistake, one whisper of betrayal, could put them in the crosshairs. It created a strange, almost religious devotion to silence. No one questioned. No one refused. To hesitate was to die. The newspapers, hungry for sensational stories, painted the city as a killing ground. Headlines screamed of gangland slayings, mysterious bodies, execution-style shootings. Reporters began to speculate about an organized army of hitmen, a murder factory hidden in plain sight. They didn't know the name Murder Incorporated yet, but the public already sensed the truth. Something systematic was at work, something colder than random crime. Prosecutors whispered the same thing behind closed doors. They saw patterns in the killings, connections between cases across different boroughs. But knowing wasn't the same as proving. Witnesses vanished, juries were intimidated, and judges turned their heads. The law struggled to grasp shadows while Albert's killers walked openly in the daylight. It was a frustrating, humiliating failure, and each acquittal only added to his myth of invincibility. For Albert, that myth was a weapon. He cultivated it, leaned into it, made it part of his identity. He wanted men to believe he was everywhere, that his eyes saw everything, that his reach extended into every corner of the city. Fear became a currency more valuable than dollars. It bought silence, obedience, and loyalty. And unlike money, it could never be stolen. But power built on fear carries a corrosive cost. It isolates. Men who once laughed with Albert now watched him carefully, measuring every mood swing, every glance, wondering if they would be next. His unpredictability, his volcanic temper, made him as dangerous to friends as he was to enemies. And in the Mafia, that kind of danger never went unnoticed. Still, during these years, Albert reigned at his peak. The streets obeyed him. The syndicate depended on him. And the climate of terror he created ensured that rules were followed, debts were paid, and dissent was crushed before it could take root. He was no longer just a man. He was an institution of violence, the Lord High Executioner of the American Mafia. And yet, every institution has cracks. Prosecutors were watching closer. Rivals within the Mafia were whispering louder. And the blood that ruled the streets had a way of seeping into the foundations of the empire itself. Because when fear becomes the only language spoken, the day always comes when someone decides to answer it with betrayal. Chapter 8. Castellammare's War Aftermath. The war had ended, but the silence it left behind was almost more unsettling than the gunfire. For nearly 2 years, New York had been torn apart by the Castellammare's War, a bloody chess match between Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Streets ran with blood. Coffins filled neighborhoods from Harlem to Brooklyn. But in the spring of 1931, both Masuria and Maranzano lay dead, and a new order rose from their ashes. Albert Anastasia wasn't the architect of that order. He wasn't the strategist like Luciano or the diplomat like Costello. He was something else entirely, the blade that had cleared the path. In the aftermath of the war, when the smoke lifted and the streets began to breathe again, Albert found himself standing inside a structure unlike anything the Mafia had seen before. Luciano's vision was bold. No more wars fought by stubborn old-world bosses who couldn't let go of Sicily's ghosts. No more endless vendettas that drained money and men. Instead, a syndicate, organized like a corporation, with rules, profit-sharing, and a governing body known as the Commission. It was revolutionary, and it required something even more radical: enforcement. The rules meant nothing if men thought they could ignore them. That's where Albert came in. The killings of Masuria and Maranzano weren't just assassinations, they were statements. They told the old guard that their time had ended, that a younger generation now wrote the rules. And those rules had teeth. Behind the polished veneer of Luciano's syndicate was the knowledge that disobedience would be punished swiftly and brutally. That knowledge had a name, and it was Anastasia. For Albert, the war's end was both a reward and a beginning. He had proved himself useful, loyal to Luciano's cause, willing to kill without hesitation when called upon. In return, he was elevated, not just in reputation but in rank. He was no longer a dockside thug or a nameless enforcer. He was part of the new order's machinery, a trusted figure in its inner workings. But what did that trust look like? It wasn't handshakes or public acknowledgments. Men like Luciano didn't shower praise. Instead, trust meant responsibility. Albert was tasked with ensuring the stability of the system. When a dispute threatened to spiral into violence, he was the one who settled it, with a conversation if possible, with bullets if necessary. His presence alone was enough to remind men that the Commission's decisions weren't suggestions. They were law. The atmosphere in the city changed after the war. For ordinary people, the killings seemed to ease. Headlines shifted away from daily mob murders to other crises: politics, the Depression, the rise of labor movements. But inside the Mafia, the bloodletting hadn't stopped. It had simply become more selective, more targeted. Instead of chaos, there was calculation. And Albert was the executor of that calculation. Imagine sitting in a room, accused of cheating the syndicate or of holding back money owed to the bosses. You plead your case, your voice shaking, your hands sweating. The room is quiet, men smoking, listening, their faces unreadable. And then, in the corner, Albert clears his throat or shifts his chair. That sound, that small gesture, is louder than any verdict. You already know your fate. You already know you won't walk out alive. That was the climate he created, where even silence became lethal. The syndicate's strength came from balance, from keeping violence under control. But the only way to keep it under control was to remind everyone what happened when it broke loose. Albert's role was paradoxical. He was both the cause of fear and the guarantor of peace. Without his shadow looming over the city, men might have tested the new system, pushed its limits. With him, those thoughts withered before they could grow. Luciano and Costello leaned on him heavily during these years. Costello, with his political connections, understood that his influence over judges and lawmakers was only as strong as his ability to maintain order on the streets. Luciano, exiled in a few short years, would need men like Albert to enforce the system in his absence. The executioner wasn't just a killer anymore. He was the syndicate's insurance policy. But power, once tasted, always demands more. Albert thrived in his role, but it also deepened the parts of him that others found dangerous. His temper grew shorter, his rage sharper. Men whispered that he was too reckless, that he enjoyed the killings more than the bosses were comfortable admitting. Enforcement was supposed to be cold, detached, businesslike. But for Albert, there was passion in it, even pleasure. That distinction unsettled men who believed in rules above all. Still, no one dared move against him. His loyalty to Luciano was unquestionable, and his value undeniable. To strike at Albert would be to strike at the very system Luciano had built. And so his legend grew, his shadow stretching longer, his presence more inescapable. For Albert, these years were the closest he came to true power. Not the power of a boss, sitting at the head of a family, but the power of inevitability. He was the man who made sure the system worked. He was the edge of the blade, the final say in disputes, the one name no one wanted whispered in their direction. Yet, beneath the stability of the new order, danger still lurked. Rival factions simmered, resentments festered, and the Commission's unity was fragile. The same men who praised Albert in one breath might plot against him in the next. He was a weapon, but weapons are double-edged. The very fear that made him indispensable also made him a threat. The aftermath of the Castellamarese War had given Albert Anastasia everything he craved: power, recognition, purpose. But it had also set him on a path from which there was no turning back. He wasn't just a killer anymore. He was the Lord High Executioner of an empire that depended on fear to survive. And fear, as Albert would one day learn, has a way of turning on its master. Chapter 9. The Luciano Trial, 1936. The courtroom was suffocating. Cigarette smoke lingered above the packed rows of spectators. Reporters scratched frantic notes into their pads, and the judge's gavel slammed again and again, struggling to keep control. But no one's eyes were on him. All eyes were fixed on the man at the defense table, Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the architect of modern organized crime, the man who had turned New York's underworld into a syndicate. It was the summer of 1936, and for the first time in years, it looked like Luciano's empire might actually crumble. He wasn't on trial for murder or racketeering. Instead, the state accused him of something far less glamorous but just as deadly: running a vast prostitution ring across the city. It was the brainchild of Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, a young and ambitious lawyer who saw Luciano as the perfect target to make his name. Dewey wanted to prove that no man, no matter how rich, no matter how feared, was untouchable. The witnesses lined up against Luciano were damning. Women pulled from brothels, pimps arrested in raids, underlings desperate to save their own skins. Each pointed their fingers at the boss, painting him as the man pulling the strings behind every dirty dollar. For the jury, it was a portrait of a king brought low, of an empire built not just on gambling and booze, but on flesh and desperation. But Luciano wasn't alone. He had soldiers, allies, men who owed him everything. And when the state came for him, some of those men stepped into the light to defend him. Among them was Albert Anastasia. For Albert, testifying was dangerous. The courtroom wasn't his arena. He was a man of shadows, of violence carried out in silence. But here, under the eyes of the press and the law, he had to play a different role. He had to show loyalty, to prove that the syndicate stood behind its leader. His very presence in that courtroom was a message to both the jury and the underworld. Luciano was not abandoned. When he took the stand, reporters scribbled furiously. This was no anonymous dock worker. This was the man whispered about as the Lord High Executioner, though the newspapers hadn't yet fully embraced the title. To see him in daylight, under oath, was surreal. He spoke calmly, carefully, denying Luciano's involvement, insisting that the charges were baseless. He painted Luciano not as a pimp or exploiter, but as a businessman unfairly targeted by overzealous lawmen. To the jury, Albert's testimony may have seemed like loyalty, but to those who knew the underworld, it was more than that. It was survival. If Luciano fell, the balance of power would shift violently. The commission, the syndicate, all of it might unravel. By defending his boss, Albert wasn't just protecting Luciano. He was protecting the system that gave him purpose, the empire of blood and fear that kept him powerful. But Dewey was relentless. He tore into witnesses, hammered at inconsistencies, painted Luciano's allies as liars. And the jury, ordinary men and women plucked from New York streets, weighed every word under the weight of the headlines screaming from newsstands. When the verdict came, it was like a thunderclap. Guilty. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. For a man who had once seemed invincible, it was a stunning fall. The newspapers splashed it across the front pages, hailing Dewey as a hero, celebrating the law's triumph over organized crime. For Albert, the trial was a test and a warning. Loyalty had demanded his defense of Luciano, but loyalty had not saved the boss. If the state could bring down Lucky, what did that mean for the rest of them? What did that mean for him? Inside the Mafia, the verdict sent shockwaves. Luciano had been the architect, the one who had envisioned the commission and enforced its rules. Without him, the system wobbled. Power began to shift, alliances realigned, and new contenders stepped forward to fill the void. Frank Costello emerged as the political face of the syndicate, smoothing relationships with judges and senators. Vito Genovese lurked in the background, hungry for control. And Albert, the executioner, tightened his grip on enforcement. But the trial also revealed something else about him. Unlike many mobsters, who recoiled from the glare of publicity, Albert didn't flinch. He faced the court, spoke clearly, carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he could not be touched. Some saw arrogance, others saw resolve, but everyone who watched knew this. He was not a man to be underestimated. Behind closed doors, though, he must have felt the tremors. The law had cracked Luciano's armor, and in doing so, it had exposed the syndicate's vulnerability. Murder Incorporated still functioned. The commission still met. But the trial had proved that the underworld was not invisible. The state was watching, probing, waiting for mistakes. For Albert, mistakes were not an option. He had built his identity on certainty, on the inevitability of death for those who crossed him. But the Luciano trial had shown him another inevitability, that one day, the law might come for him too. The aftermath was a strange paradox. On one hand, Luciano's imprisonment weakened the syndicate. On the other, it elevated men like Anastasia. With Luciano gone, the need for enforcers grew greater. Disputes flared, loyalty wavered, and enforcement became the glue that held the system together. Albert's blade was sharper than ever, his role more vital. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a pillar. And yet, pillars can crack. With Luciano behind bars, the underworld entered a new era, one where ambition and betrayal simmered hotter than ever. Costello maneuvered in daylight, Genovese plotted in the shadows, and Albert waited, watching, enforcing. His loyalty to Luciano had been proven in court, but loyalty in the Mafia was a fragile thing. Today it was praised. Tomorrow it might be his undoing. The trial of 1936 had been a spectacle, a warning shot, a reshaping of the underworld's balance. For Albert Anastasia, it was also a mirror, reflecting both his strength and his vulnerability. He had stood in the light and survived. But the shadows he commanded were growing darker. And in those shadows, men were already whispering. Chapter 10, World War II and Citizenship. The world was at war, and suddenly even men with blood on their hands were being called to wear a uniform. In 1942, as young Americans marched off to fight in Europe and the Pacific, an unlikely name appeared among them: Albert Anastasia. It seemed almost absurd. The man whispered about as the Lord High Executioner, the overseer of Murder Incorporated, now standing in line with recruits, his hair cropped short, his uniform pressed. For years, prosecutors had hunted him, detectives had shadowed him, newspapers had painted him as the most feared killer in New York. But in the chaos of World War II, Albert found something extraordinary, an opportunity to step out of the shadows and, in the eyes of the government, become something else entirely. The draft was a machine that didn't care much about reputations. America needed bodies, men to fill ships and barracks, men to march into hell for the promise of victory. And Albert, like millions of others, was swept into it. He wasn't sent to the front lines. No one was eager to hand a rifle to a man with his history. Instead, he served in the U.S. Army, stationed stateside, his duties vague, his presence more symbolic than essential. But for Albert, symbolism was everything. Each day he wore the uniform. He rewrote a piece of his story. In the eyes of the law, he wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was a soldier. It was a strange camouflage, one that even he might have found ironic. The same hands that had strangled men with ropes now carried the emblem of the United States. Serving gave him something else too: leverage. While other mobsters faced deportation hearings or struggled with citizenship, Albert now had a claim to legitimacy. He wasn't just an immigrant with a violent past. He was a man who had put on the uniform in America's hour of need. And in a country desperate to believe in redemption stories, that counted for something. The timing couldn't have been better. For years, Albert had lived under the shadow of possible deportation. Prosecutors whispered about shipping him back to Italy, stripping him of his foothold in the American underworld. It was a threat that had teeth. Deportation had been used against other gangsters before, men who suddenly found themselves back in the old country, their power evaporated. For Albert, it was the nightmare scenario. Calabria was the place of his hunger, his humiliation. America was the place of his empire. He couldn't go back. So he played the game. He leaned on his service record, however unremarkable it might have been, and pushed for citizenship. And remarkably, he got it. Despite the blood on his name, despite the bodies linked to his shadow, Albert Anastasia became a naturalized American citizen. It was a stunning irony. The man accused of overseeing hundreds of murders, The man whose very nickname spoke of execution now carried papers that made him officially part of the nation he had terrorized. While ordinary immigrants scraped and struggled for years to prove their worth, Albert had stepped into the fold with a mixture of timing, influence, and audacity. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to see it through Albert's eyes. Citizenship wasn't just paperwork. It was armor. It meant protection from deportation, security against one of the few weapons the government could wield effectively against men like him. For Albert, who lived with a constant awareness of threats, rivals, police, betrayal, this was a shield he desperately needed. But it also revealed something deeper about the way the underworld and the world of politics overlapped. Connections mattered. Influence mattered. Men like Frank Costello, with his reach into judges' chambers and politicians' pockets, made sure the wheels turned in Albert's favor. Justice, in this era, was not blind, it was negotiable. And Albert was a man who had learned to negotiate with fear and power in equal measure. The war years changed more than just his legal status. They also reshaped the Mafia itself. With Luciano imprisoned and then deported, Costello rose as the syndicate's diplomat, smoothing the organization's image. Meanwhile, the docks, Albert's old kingdom, boomed with wartime shipping. Controlling them meant controlling an artery of the war effort itself. Union leaders bowed to mob influence, and the government, stretched thin and desperate to keep cargo moving, often looked the other way. In this climate, Albert's reputation as an enforcer gave him enormous leverage. And yet, wearing the uniform must have carried a strange duality. Imagine Albert standing in formation, shoulder to shoulder with young men barely out of high school, men who believed they were fighting for freedom and justice. Did he feel pride? Did he feel mockery? Did he feel nothing at all? No one can know for sure. But what we do know is that Albert was a man who adapted. And in those years, adaptation meant blending into the fabric of patriotism, even if only for appearances. There were whispers, too, rumors that his ties to the army might have been more than symbolic. Some speculated that men like him, with influence over the docks, may have quietly assisted in securing shipping lanes from sabotage. After all, the Mafia had long controlled the piers, and during wartime, those piers were critical. Whether or not Albert played an official role in safeguarding them is debated, but the possibility itself shows how fluid the line between criminal and patriot became. For Albert, though, the result was undeniable. By the war's end, he stood not just as a feared enforcer, but as a citizen of the United States. It was a transformation as improbable as it was strategic. The boy who had once crossed the Atlantic in steerage, the dockside thug who had beaten men bloody for a paycheck, the executioner whose shadow haunted the city. Now he was shielded by the very system he had defied. But citizenship didn't wash away the blood. It didn't erase the fear he inspired or the suspicion that clung to him like smoke. If anything, it made him more dangerous. Now, he was harder to touch. Deportation was no longer a threat. Exile was no longer an option. He was rooted in America, bound to the streets he ruled, fused to the empire he helped build. And so he returned to those streets with renewed confidence. The war might have pulled him into the uniform, but the underworld pulled him back just as quickly. The killings didn't stop. The enforcement didn't ease. Murder Incorporated still cast its long shadow. Albert's service had been a chapter, not a transformation. He hadn't become a different man. He had simply become a man harder to destroy. But there was another truth buried in this paradox. By putting on the uniform, by swearing loyalty to the United States, Albert had stepped into a contradiction that would haunt him. He was both soldier and executioner, citizen and outlaw. He belonged to the nation he exploited, swore allegiance to the laws he spent his life breaking. And in that contradiction lay a tension that could not last forever. For the moment, though, Albert stood untouchable. The war was ending. America was victorious. And Anastasia, improbably, was secure. He had the docks. He had his reputation. He had citizenship. He had everything a man in his world could want. But in the Mafia, security is always an illusion. Victory always breeds ambition. And while Albert celebrated his new shield, men around him were already scheming, already watching, already planning for a future where even the Lord High Executioner might bleed. Because in the world Albert lived in, peace was never permanent. It was only the calm before the storm. Chapter 11. Union Power. The cranes groaned as they swung heavy cargo off ships, their steel arms creaking under the weight of crates filled with coffee, bananas, whiskey, and weapons bound for Europe. The Brooklyn waterfront in the late 1940s wasn't just a workplace. It was the beating heart of commerce in America. Every ship that docked, every crate that hit the planks, represented money. And in that world, Albert Anastasia discovered something even more powerful than bullets: unions. It started quietly, almost invisibly. Men on the docks lined up for jobs each morning, desperate for work. They didn't answer to government officials or company bosses. They answered to the union. And the union, in turn, answered to the mob. Control the union, and you didn't just control labor. You controlled the flow of billions of dollars in cargo. You controlled the arteries that fed New York's economy. For Albert, this wasn't just opportunity. It was destiny. He had already earned his reputation with blood. Now, he learned how to turn that reputation into leverage. Union leaders quickly realized that standing against Anastasia wasn't just foolish, it was suicidal. If a foreman refused to play ball, his dock would grind to a halt. If a worker talked too loudly about corruption, he might not make it home. Fear had always been Albert's weapon, but now it was sharpened with something even stronger: necessity. The companies needed the docks running. The workers needed their jobs. And Albert was the man who could guarantee, or destroy, both. The methods were simple but devastatingly effective. Payoffs flowed like rivers. Employers who wanted labor peace slipped envelopes under tables. Politicians who wanted votes relied on dockside influence. Workers who wanted steady shifts kicked back a portion of their wages. Every transaction was laced with intimidation, every handshake shadowed by the possibility of violence. It wasn't just about cash. Control over unions gave Albert power far beyond the waterfront. Imagine a strike shutting down the flow of goods into New York Harbor. Imagine ships lined up, unable to unload, businesses across the city choking without supplies. The threat of such a shutdown was enough to make mayors listen, governors hesitate, and companies pay whatever was demanded. The docks weren't just piers of wood and steel, they were levers. And in Albert's hands, those levers could move entire industries. He wasn't the only mobster with his fingers in labor, but few embraced it as completely. Others saw unions as one racket among many. For Albert, they became the foundation of his empire. He was no longer just the Lord High Executioner in the shadows. He was now a power broker in daylight, a man whose influence stretched from city hall to shipping magnates, from union halls to mafia boardrooms. Still, violence never vanished from his playbook. There were stories of men who resisted union racketeering, who believed they could stand on principle. They rarely lasted long. A strikebreaker might be found beaten half to death in an alley. A union official who refused to sign over loyalty might disappear entirely. These weren't accidents. They were lessons, and every man on the waterfront absorbed them. But there was another side to Albert's grip on the docks. For many workers, corrupt as the system was, it also offered stability. A man who played by the rules, paid his dues, stayed loyal, might find steady work, protection from rival gangs, even a sense of belonging. It was exploitation wrapped in security, oppression disguised as order. And for men living paycheck to paycheck, that trade-off often felt like survival. Albert understood this better than most. He had once been that desperate worker, waiting on the docks for a chance at a shift. He knew the hunger, the humiliation, the desperation. And now, he twisted that memory into power. He made himself the gatekeeper, ensuring that no one forgot who controlled their fate. The irony was striking. The boy from Calabria who had fought for scraps was now the man who decided who ate and who starved. He had transformed hunger into authority, desperation into dominance. To him, it must have felt like justice. To the men under his thumb, it was simply the way things were. Law enforcement tried to pierce this system, but unions were tricky terrain. On the surface, they were legal, even protected by federal law. To prove corruption meant untangling a web of payoffs, intimidation, and silence. Witnesses were scarce. Workers who might have spoken up knew the cost of disloyalty. Detectives patrolling the docks found themselves isolated, surrounded by men who would rather die than testify. Even when prosecutors brought cases, Albert often slipped through. The image of a soldier in the U.S. Army still clung to him, his citizenship papers serving as a shield. To juries, he wasn't just a mobster. He was also a man who had once worn the uniform. That contradiction, as jarring as it was, worked in his favor. The government had given him legitimacy, and now he used it as cover. The unions also gave him something else: connections to other crime families. Labor racketeering was a cooperative enterprise. No one family controlled everything. Instead, they carved up territories, shared spoils, and negotiated influence. For Albert, this meant alliances and rivalries that stretched across the entire Mafia landscape. His role as an enforcer now blended with his role as a negotiator. He wasn't just feared for his violence. He was respected for his reach. But every step upward made him more vulnerable. The more money he pulled from unions, the more headlines screamed of corruption. The more power he displayed, the more rivals began to whisper. Men like Carlo Gambino watched carefully, smiling in meetings, plotting in private. In the Mafia, strength attracted loyalty, but it also attracted daggers. Still, for a time, Albert stood untouchable. He had the unions. He had the docks. He had the politicians, the employers, and the workers all caught in his web. To walk the waterfront in those years was to walk in his shadow. Every ship unloaded, every crate lifted, carried his invisible signature. The lifeblood of New York commerce flowed through his hands. And yet, beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Investigative journalists dug deeper, writing exposes about union corruption. Federal prosecutors whispered about racketeering charges. Workers, though cowed, grew restless under endless kickbacks. And inside the Mafia itself, jealousy simmered. Albert had turned violence into business. But the more he blurred that line, the more dangerous it became. Because in the world he lived in, business was never just business. It was war dressed in a suit. And Albert Anastasia, for all his power, was about to discover that no grip lasts forever. Chapter 12, Ally of Frank Costello. The hotel suite smelled of expensive cigars and polished wood. A group of men sat around a card table, the air thick with laughter, smoke, and tension that never truly left rooms like this. At the center of it all sat Frank Costello, the so-called prime minister of the underworld. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his fists. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his words measured, his tone persuasive, like a man who never had to force obedience. And across from him, sitting quieter than usual, was Albert Anastasia. It was an odd pairing at first glance. Costello was a master of politics, a gangster who courted judges and senators, who knew how to bend the law with handshakes and envelopes instead of pistols. He dressed like a businessman, spoke like a diplomat, and carried himself as if he belonged in boardrooms rather than back alleys. Albert, by contrast, was the embodiment of violence. He was blunt where Costello was subtle, terrifying where Costello was charming. One made men bend with fear. The other made them bend with influence. And yet, together, they formed a partnership that would shape the next chapter of New York's underworld. Costello needed Albert. For all his polish, politics only worked if there was muscle behind it. A senator might take a bribe, but he only kept his promises if he believed the consequences of betrayal were real. Albert made those consequences real. His reputation as the Lord High Executioner was the perfect shadow to Costello's daylight. Every time Costello leaned on a politician, that politician knew what loomed behind him. Albert, in turn, needed Costello. He had power on the docks, unions under his thumb, and a reputation forged in blood. But politics was foreign to him. Courtrooms were dangerous, headlines unpredictable. Costello gave him a shield. By aligning with the prime minister, Albert gained protection in places violence couldn't reach: City Hall, Albany, even Washington. Costello's network smoothed paths, silenced investigations, and bought the kind of legitimacy Albert could never have earned on his own. Together, they were a paradox that worked. Costello provided the polish. Albert provided the terror. And in the fragile balance of the Mafia, both were needed. Their partnership grew in the aftermath of Luciano's imprisonment and deportation. With Luciano gone, Costello inherited much of his influence, steering the syndicate with a steady, political hand. But Vito Genovese lurked in the background, scheming, waiting for his chance to seize control. In that looming power struggle, Costello leaned on Albert more heavily than ever. He needed a loyal ally who could enforce decisions with absolute finality. Albert didn't hesitate. Loyalty was something he had always prided himself on, at least to those he considered allies. Costello offered him respect, influence, and opportunity. In return, Albert offered protection, enforcement, and the certainty of violence when needed. Their bond wasn't born of friendship. It was born of mutual necessity. The two men represented different faces of the Mafia. Costello cultivated politicians, dined with celebrities, and moved in circles that blurred the line between legal and illegal. Albert lurked in the darker corners, the reminder that beneath the charm was still an empire built on blood. To outsiders, Costello looked like a statesman. To insiders, he looked like a man who had Anastasia on his side. And that combination made him formidable. But the partnership also revealed contrasts. Costello believed in stability. He wanted peace, steady profits, and a mafia that resembled a corporation more than a street gang. Violence, to him, was a last resort. Albert, on the other hand, often lived by the blade. His temper, his unpredictability, made him dangerous even to his allies. Costello would sometimes shake his head, frustrated by Albert's outbursts, his unwillingness to temper himself. Yet he also understood the value of that unpredictability. Fear had its uses, and Albert embodied it better than anyone. Union power was one of their shared strengths. Costello understood how labor could be used politically, while Albert enforced it physically. Together, they turned dockside rackets into a political weapon. Strikes could be started or ended with a word. Votes could be swayed. Campaigns could be won. It was corruption woven so tightly into the fabric of the city that pulling it apart seemed impossible. But alliances in the Mafia are never permanent. Even as Albert and Costello built their partnership, Genovese plotted in silence. He saw Costello's diplomacy as weakness, Albert's brutality as recklessness. To him, they were obstacles. And in the world of organized crime, obstacles were never tolerated for long. Still, for a time, the partnership flourished. Costello rose as the Mafia's political face, attending galas, cultivating judges, moving in high society. Albert thrived as his protector, his enforcer, the looming threat behind his every move. When Costello spoke softly, men listened, because they knew Albert stood silently behind him. Yet silence can be deceptive. Beneath the calm, beneath the veneer of stability, storms were gathering. Genovese's ambition, law enforcement scrutiny, and Albert's own volatility were threads waiting to unravel. Costello could shield him from politicians and prosecutors, but he couldn't shield him from the underworld's inevitable betrayals. And Albert, for all his loyalty, must have sensed it. He had lived long enough to know that every alliance carried an expiration date. Still, in those years, standing beside the prime minister of the mob, he seemed untouchable. He was no longer just an executioner in the shadows. He was a power broker, a partner in one of the Mafia's most formidable alliances. But power in the Mafia is never stable. It shifts like sand, reshaping with every betrayal, every bullet, every whispered conspiracy. And as Albert stood with Costello, he may not have realized that the very loyalty binding them together would soon make him a target in the war to come. Because in the world Albert inhabited, alliances were not built to last. They were built to be broken. Chapter 13, Anastasia's Temper. The restaurant was crowded, waiters darting between tables, the hum of conversation rising above the clatter of plates. It was a normal night, ordinary in every way, until the air shifted. At one table, Albert Anastasia's face darkened. A man across from him had said something. Maybe a joke, maybe an insult, maybe nothing at all. No one remembers the words. What they remember is what happened next. Albert stood, his chair scraping the floor, and in a blur of motion his hands were around the man's throat. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, all of it froze as Albert lifted him out of his seat, eyes burning, his grip tightening until the man's face turned red. People shouted, begged, tried to intervene. Albert didn't hear them. His temper had flared, and once it did, the outcome was no longer in question. That was the reality of living in Anastasia's orbit. His rages came without warning, sudden storms that could turn an evening of calm into a moment of terror. And those storms were not theatrical displays. They were deadly. Stories of Albert's temper circulated across the underworld, each one darker than the last. There were tales of him killing men for slights so small they sounded almost trivial, an insult, a delay, a careless gesture. For most gangsters, violence was calculated, a tool used when it served a purpose. For Albert, sometimes it seemed to erupt purely out of anger, as if control itself was a fragile thread he barely managed to hold. One story told of a tailor who had botched a suit. To most men, it was an annoyance, maybe a raised voice, maybe a refusal to pay. To Albert, it was an insult he could not tolerate. The tailor was beaten so badly he never worked again. Another tale described a man who questioned Albert's decision during a card game. He never left the room alive. Whether all these stories were true hardly mattered. What mattered was that people believed them. And that belief was enough to make every man who dealt with Anastasia tread lightly. Fear is a powerful weapon, but Albert's version of it was unique. Other bosses cultivated fear through reputation, through carefully staged acts of violence designed to send messages. Albert didn't need staging. His unpredictability was the message. No one ever knew what would set him off, and that uncertainty created a climate of dread far more suffocating than open threats. Imagine sitting at a table with him, unsure if the wrong word, the wrong glance, the wrong tone might ignite something you couldn't control. Men who were fearless in the face of bullets still found themselves sweating in his presence, not because of what he said, but because of what he might suddenly do. Even his allies weren't immune. Frank Costello, polished and political, often grew frustrated with Albert's volatility. In meetings, Costello might carefully build consensus, smoothing over rivalries, only for Albert's temper to shatter the illusion of calm. A slammed fist, a shouted threat, a sudden lunge toward a man who had spoken too confidently. Costello valued him, but he also feared him. Everyone did. The psychology behind it was complicated. Part of it came from his past. Albert had grown up in hunger, humiliation, fighting for scraps on the docks. Every slight carried the sting of those early years, every insult a reminder of when he was powerless. His rage was not just about the moment. It was about everything he had endured before. Violence became both revenge and validation. But part of it was also his identity. Albert had built his reputation on fear, on being the man who never hesitated. To hesitate was to look weak, and in his world, weakness was death. So he embraced his temper, let it define him, let it remind everyone around him that he was not a man to be crossed. This temper, however, came at a cost. In the Mafia, reputation mattered, but so did control. Bosses wanted soldiers who followed orders, who killed when told, and only when told. Albert's volatility blurred that line. His outbursts risked drawing attention, making enemies, or creating problems where none existed. Even his allies began to wonder, was his loyalty stronger than his rage, or would his anger one day burn through the very system he had sworn to protect? Still, his violence was tolerated because it was useful. Fear kept the docks under control. Fear silenced potential witnesses. Fear maintained order when diplomacy failed. As long as his temper served a purpose, the commission allowed it. But men whispered in corners, wondering how long that balance could last. The temper also created contradictions in Albert's character. At times, he could be surprisingly generous, offering kindness to friends or loyalty to allies. But the generosity was always overshadowed by the lurking possibility of eruption. It was like living beside a volcano, beautiful in the calm, terrifying in the eruption, impossible to predict. For the men under him, survival meant learning how to read him. They watched his expressions, listened to the rhythm of his voice, searched for signs of the storm. Some claimed they could sense it, the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands twitched, the way silence stretched too long before he spoke. And when they sensed it, they knew to step back, to stay quiet, to hope the storm passed over them. Law enforcement observed the same patterns. Detectives who shadowed him described him as intense, restless, quick to lash out even at minor provocations. They saw the duality, a man capable of commanding an empire, yet also a man ruled by impulses he couldn't always control. It made him both terrifying and vulnerable. Terrifying because no one could anticipate him. Vulnerable because unpredictability breeds enemies. The newspapers fed on his temper, exaggerating stories, painting him as a near-mythical figure of rage. Some called him insane. Others described him as a man possessed, driven by demons he couldn't exorcise. Whether the descriptions were accurate or not, they all added to the legend. And Albert, consciously or not, leaned into that legend. If men feared him as a monster, so much the better. Monsters rarely had to explain themselves. But being a monster carries its own dangers. Allies grow cautious. Rivals grow bold. And the man who rules through fear eventually discovers that fear alone cannot hold power forever. Albert Anastasia's temper was both his weapon and his curse. It built his legend, cemented his reputation, and gave him dominance over the streets. But it also isolated him, drew suspicion, and planted seeds of doubt among even his closest allies. Every outburst was a reminder that he was not entirely controllable, that his loyalty could be consumed by his rage at any moment. And in the world he lived in, uncontrollable men rarely lived long. Still, for the moment, the legend of his temper only made him stronger. Men whispered about it in bars, warned each other in hushed tones, carried the weight of it in every decision they made. He had become more than a man. He was a force, a storm, a reminder that violence could erupt without warning. But storms eventually burn themselves out, and Albert's would one day consume him. Chapter 14. Assassination of Bugsy Siegel, 1947. The windows of the Beverly Hills mansion glowed softly that night, casting a warm light onto the quiet, manicured streets. Inside, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel lounged on a couch, a newspaper in hand, the California air drifting through the open glass doors. It was June of 1947, and though Siegel was far from his native New York, trouble had followed him across the country. Trouble, and perhaps death. From the shadows outside, a gunman raised a .30 caliber rifle and took aim. In seconds, the silence of Beverly Hills shattered. Bullets tore through the window pane, exploding glass in every direction. Siegel never stood a chance. The shot struck his head and torso, snapping him back violently, his body collapsing against the couch. Blood pooled on the cream carpet. The once golden boy of the Mafia was gone. The murder of Bugsy Siegel became one of the most infamous hits in American mob history, not just for its brutality, but for the mystery that surrounded it. Who had ordered it? Who had pulled the trigger? And hovering in the shadows of speculation was the name of Albert Anastasia. Siegel had always been a different kind of gangster. Charismatic, daring, reckless. He wasn't content with rackets in New York or bootlegging profits. He dreamed bigger. In Las Vegas, he saw a city rising out of the desert, a place where gambling could be turned into an empire. With mob money backing him, he poured millions into the Flamingo Hotel. But the project spiraled out of control. Costs ballooned. Deadlines stretched. Investors grew restless. For men in the Mafia, money was the true measure of loyalty. Dreams were tolerated, but only if they paid dividends. Siegel's vision had become a liability, a sinkhole swallowing cash that others expected returned with interest. The syndicate, patient at first, began to lose faith. And in that loss of faith, suspicion grew. Was Siegel skimming money off the top? Was he gambling with their investment in ways no one had approved? In a world where trust was already fragile, those suspicions were deadly. Rumors swirled that the bosses had convened, that the commission itself had debated Siegel's fate. Some believed Meyer Lansky, his old friend, tried to protect him. Others claimed the vote was unanimous, that Siegel had outlived his usefulness. But even if the decision was collective, someone had to carry it out. That's where the speculation about Anastasia comes in. Albert was, by then, the Lord High Executioner, the man whose reputation was built on finality. If the syndicate wanted a problem erased, he was the one they trusted. His name was tied to dozens, maybe hundreds, of executions. Why not Siegel's? Some stories claim Albert personally approved the hit, ensuring that the order was carried out with precision. Others suggest he may have coordinated it, sending trusted men to California to do the job. There were even whispers that Albert himself had a personal stake, that Siegel's reckless spending threatened to destabilize rackets that fed money back to him. But certainty has always eluded historians. No hard evidence ties Anastasia directly to the assassination. The gunman was never identified. The order, if it came from the commission, was cloaked in secrecy. The Mafia had always operated with plausible deniability, making sure that the line between rumor and fact remained blurred. And in the case of Siegel's death, that blur has never cleared. Still, Anastasia's shadow loomed over the story. His reputation was such that even if he hadn't given the order, people believed he could have. And in the Mafia, belief often mattered more than fact. His name carried weight. His presence lent credibility to whispers. To the public, to law enforcement, to rival gangsters, the idea of Anastasia orchestrating Siegel's end felt fitting, even inevitable. What made the assassination so shocking wasn't just who died, but where it happened. This wasn't a back alley in Brooklyn or a smoky bar in Manhattan. This was Beverly Hills, the heart of glamour, the playground of movie stars and millionaires. The violence of the underworld had spilled into the sunlit world of Hollywood, reminding America that no amount of wealth or charm could protect a man once the Mafia marked him. For Anastasia, whether involved or not, the killing only reinforced his legend. The Lord High Executioner wasn't bound by geography. His reach, real or imagined, stretched from New York to California, from the docks to the desert. Fear doesn't need evidence to grow. It only needs whispers, and Albert had whispers in abundance. But legends cut both ways. The more his name was tied to infamous hits like Siegel's, the more law enforcement circled. Prosecutors speculated. Detectives scribbled his name in their notebooks. Each time his shadow passed over another killing, his file thickened. He was becoming not just a man, but a symbol of Mafia violence, the face of a system that thrived on blood. And symbols attract attention. Inside the underworld, Siegel's assassination sent shockwaves. In Las Vegas, the Flamingo didn't die with him, it thrived. The Mafia doubled down on gambling, pouring money into casinos, transforming the desert into an empire of neon and cash. The dream Siegel had chased was real after all, but it would no longer bear his name. It would belong to the syndicate. And in New York, Albert's position only solidified. He was the man whose reputation grew with every whisper of death, whether true or not. To allies, he was indispensable. To rivals, he was terrifying. To law enforcement, he was a target too dangerous to ignore. Yet beneath the surface of this power was fragility. The Mafia tolerated ruthlessness, but it also demanded control. Albert's temper, his unpredictability, and the growing attention around his name made some uneasy. Even as he grew stronger, he was planting the seeds of his vulnerability. The assassination of Bugsy Siegel remains one of organized crime's enduring mysteries. Did Anastasia order it? Did he simply oversee it? Or was his reputation so feared that history itself has cast him into the role, guilty by legend, if not by fact? The truth may never be known. But in the end, it hardly matters. Because in the underworld, perception is reality. And in 1947, the reality was this. Albert Anastasia's shadow loomed so large that even on the quiet streets of Beverly Hills, it could still be felt. And while Siegel's body cooled on that California carpet, the whispers about the Lord High Executioner only grew louder. Chapter 15, The Mangano Brothers. The body floated in the shallows, face swollen, clothes clinging to the waterlogged frame. Fishermen who spotted it whispered and crossed themselves before calling the police. It was April of 1951, and Vincent Mangano, head of one of New York's 5 Mafia families, was gone. Officially, the case was unsolved. Unofficially, everyone knew the name whispered behind closed doors, Albert Anastasia. The story of how it came to this began years earlier. Anastasia was part of the Mangano family, under the leadership of Vincent and his brother Philip. On paper, Vincent was the boss, ruling with the authority of old-world tradition. Albert was his underboss, the man expected to enforce loyalty and carry out orders. But Albert Anastasia was no ordinary subordinate. His reputation, his power over the docks, his alliance with Frank Costello, all of it made him a figure too large to be controlled. And that was the problem. The Manganos were old-school mafiosi. They believed in hierarchy, in keeping bosses above the fray, in reminding soldiers of their place. But Albert was never comfortable with subservience. He had clawed his way up from nothing, forged his identity in blood. To bow his head before men he considered weaker, less feared, less connected, burned him like fire. Tensions simmered for years. Meetings grew tense, voices raised, threats veiled, and then not so veiled. Vincent resented Albert's independence, his closeness to Costello, his growing influence over the unions. Philip, hot-tempered and outspoken, often clashed with him directly. The brothers saw him as insubordinate, a rival in the making. Albert saw them as obstacles, relics clinging to authority they no longer deserved. In a world where power was measured by both money and fear, Albert had both in abundance. He controlled the docks. He commanded the loyalty of killers. And his friendship with Costello gave him political cover the Manganos could never match. To Vincent and Philip, that made him dangerous. To Albert, it made them expendable. The breaking point came in the early 50s. Accounts differ, but the pattern is clear. Arguments escalated, confrontations grew sharper, and the brothers began plotting ways to reign in their underboss. Albert knew it. He had survived too long in a world of betrayal not to sense when knives were being sharpened behind his back. And if Albert feared anything, it was betrayal. Then came the killings. Philip Mangano's body was found shot to death, dumped in a marshy area near Sheepshead Bay. Vincent disappeared entirely, last seen leaving his home. His body, unlike his brothers, was never found. He vanished as though the earth itself had swallowed him. The message was unmistakable. The Mangano brothers had crossed a man who did not forgive, and they had paid the price. For the Mafia, the murders were shocking, not because of the violence. It was a world steeped in blood, but because of what it meant. Killing a boss was no small act. It was breaking one of the underworld's unspoken laws, a move that risked destabilizing the delicate balance of power. But Albert was no ordinary gangster. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't impulsive. He was decisive. To him, the brothers were threats, and threats were to be eliminated. The Commission, the Mafia's ruling council, convened to address the fallout. Albert didn't hide in shame or denial. He walked in with the confidence of a man who knew the outcome was already decided. He was protected by Costello, whose influence ran deep. He was feared by every man in the room, his reputation for violence legendary. No one wanted to be next. And so, instead of punishment, Albert received legitimacy. He was confirmed as the new boss of the family, which would soon bear his name. It was one of the most dramatic rises in Mafia history. An underboss accused of killing his own bosses, not only escaping retribution but ascending to power because of it. The message it sent to the underworld was chilling. Albert Anastasia was untouchable. But beneath the triumph was a darker truth. The murders cemented his image not just as the Lord High Executioner, but as a man whose temper and ambition knew no limits. If he could kill his own bosses, what line would he not cross? Allies who applauded him in public whispered fears in private. Rivals who once sparred with him now thought twice before challenging him. His empire had been secured, but it had been secured with blood that would never wash away. For Albert, the killings may have felt inevitable. His entire life had been a lesson in striking first, in ensuring that threats never had the chance to grow. The Manganos had underestimated him, mistaking his position as underboss for submission. They forgot that Albert Anastasia didn't follow. He commanded, and when they tried to contain him, He reminded them what happened to men who tried to put chains on a storm. Still, the legacy of that moment haunted the family. The disappearances, the whispers, the cold efficiency of it all, they became part of Anastasia's myth, a warning carved into the Mafia's memory. Men would mention the Mangano brothers in hushed tones, shaking their heads, reminding each other of the day Albert seized his crown with bullets and shadows. But victory in the Mafia is never absolute. Power comes with envy. Leadership comes with betrayal. By killing the Manganos, Albert had removed one set of enemies, but in doing so, he created another. His rise confirmed his strength, but it also marked him as a man too dangerous, too unpredictable for comfort. And while he enjoyed his new status, while he basked in the authority of a boss, others began to plot. Because in the underworld, the higher a man climbs, the harder the fall. For now, though, Albert Anastasia reigned supreme. The docks were his. The unions were his. The family was his. He had silenced the Mangano brothers forever, and in their silence, his voice carried louder than ever before. But even as he ruled, the question lingered in every corner of the underworld. If Albert could kill his bosses, what would stop someone else from killing him? Chapter 16. The Mangano Disappearance, 1951. The water was calm that April morning, the tide carrying its usual debris toward the Brooklyn shore. But among the driftwood and seaweed was something darker. A fisherman spotted it first, the body of Philip Mangano, face down in the marsh, riddled with bullets. His brother Vincent, the official boss of the family, had left home earlier that same day and never returned. One murdered, one vanished. The underworld had seen violence before, but this was different. This was a purge, and all whispers pointed in one direction: Albert Anastasia. The disappearance of the Mangano brothers in 1951 marked a turning point not only for Anastasia, but for the Mafia itself. It was the day he stopped being an underboss and became the undisputed ruler of his own family. Yet the way it unfolded revealed both the ruthlessness of his character and the fragile balance of power that defined the underworld. For years, tension had simmered between Albert and the Mangano brothers. Vincent, the boss, ruled with old-world arrogance, demanding loyalty and obedience. Philip acted as his enforcer, brash and confrontational. They resented Albert's independence, his closeness to Frank Costello, his control of the docks. To them, he was a subordinate who acted like a king. To Albert, they were relics, men clinging to power that no longer belonged to them. Meetings between them often ended in shouting matches. Threats hung in the air like smoke. The brothers accused Albert of overstepping, of undermining their authority. Albert, unpredictable and volatile, accused them of weakness, of failing to understand the new realities of organized crime. Each encounter pushed them closer to a breaking point. That breaking point arrived in the spring of 1951. Exactly what triggered it remains uncertain. Some say Vincent plotted to strip Albert of his power, to have him demoted or even eliminated. Others claim Albert simply decided the brothers were liabilities, obstacles he could no longer tolerate. In the Mafia, intent is often buried beneath layers of rumor. What matters is the outcome. Philip's body was discovered quickly. Vincent's was never found. He simply disappeared into history, erased as thoroughly as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. It was an old-world fate delivered in a new-world setting. The vanishing of a man whose only crime was underestimating his underboss. The brazenness of it shocked the underworld. Killing a boss wasn't unheard of, but it was rare and dangerous. It risked destabilizing the delicate balance of the commission, the Mafia's ruling body. Yet when the smoke cleared, Albert stood unchallenged. The other bosses did not move against him. Instead, they accepted the outcome, sanctioned his rise, and confirmed him as the new head of the family. It was a moment that revealed as much about fear as it did about politics. No one wanted to be the next body in the marsh. The newspapers, of course, sensationalized the story. Headlines screamed about the Mangano brothers' mysterious fate, painting lurid pictures of betrayal and blood. Reporters speculated about power struggles, about the shadow of Anastasia looming behind it all. But in courtrooms and police stations, the evidence was thin. Witnesses remained silent. Detectives, though suspicious, had nothing they could prove. The case files grew thick with conjecture, but no charges were ever brought. Like so many murders in Albert's orbit, it became just another unsolved crime. For Albert, the disappearances were more than survival. They were a statement. He had spent years enforcing for others, building his reputation in shadows. Now, he had carved his own path with bullets and fear. The Mangano brothers were gone, and in their silence, his voice grew louder than ever. The family, once known as the Mangano family, would soon bear his name. But the killings also cast a long shadow over his reign. To some allies, they proved his strength, his unwillingness to bend, his dominance over anyone who dared oppose him. To others, they confirmed his volatility, his danger even to those closest to him. After all, if he could kill his own bosses, what line would he not cross? The disappearances also revealed the fragile morality of the Mafia. The commission, designed to prevent reckless bloodshed, had looked the other way. Why? Because fear spoke louder than rules. Albert was too valuable, too dangerous, too deeply entrenched to be punished. Justice in the underworld wasn't about fairness. It was about survival. And in that calculus, Anastasia's survival meant more than the Mangano brothers' deaths. Behind the bravado, though, one wonders what Albert himself felt. Did he feel triumph, satisfaction at finally seizing what he believed was rightfully his? Or did he feel the weight of crossing a line from which there was no return? Perhaps both. He was a man who thrived on contradiction, both loyal and treacherous, both soldier and king, both protector and predator. Killing the Manganos may have been both necessity and choice, both survival and ambition. What is certain is that it solidified his reputation forever. After 1951, Albert Anastasia was no longer just the Lord High Executioner. He was a boss. His empire stretched from the docks to the unions, from the backrooms of Brooklyn to the boardrooms of Manhattan. Men bowed not just to his reputation, but to his title. He had taken control of a family through blood, and he ruled it the same way. Yet the whispers never stopped. Some men respected him. Others feared him. Many distrusted him. And distrust in the Mafia is as lethal as any bullet. By killing the Manganos, Albert had silenced two voices, but he had awakened dozens of others. Rivals watched, allies questioned, and enemies began to plot. Still, for a time, Albert's grip was ironclad. The docks ran under his command. The unions delivered money and influence. Politicians looked the other way, and the family, reshaped by his rule, became one of the most feared in the underworld. He had eliminated his obstacles. He had claimed his crown. But crowns in the Mafia are heavy things, and the blood that buys them never dries. Albert Anastasia had taken control of the family, but in doing so, he had set himself on a path from which there was no return. The Mangano brothers had vanished. He had risen, and now, every man in the Mafia knew the truth. If Albert could kill his own bosses, there was nothing he wouldn't do. And in that truth lay the seed of his downfall. Chapter 17. The Anastasia Crime Family. The night after the Mangano brothers disappeared, the atmosphere in Brooklyn was heavy with silence. Men who usually drank late into the night, laughing and telling stories, now whispered quietly, eyes darting toward the door at every sound. They all knew what had happened, though no one dared to say it out loud. Vincent Mangano was gone. Philip Mangano was dead. And in their place stood a man no one wanted to cross, Albert Anastasia. It was not just the elimination of rivals. It was a reshaping of power. The family that had once answered to the Manganos was no longer theirs. Overnight, it became Anastasia's, molded in his image, defined by his rules, and ruled by his fear. For the first time in his life, Albert wasn't enforcing another man's will. He was enforcing his own. He moved quickly, wasting no time. Power in the Mafia was like fresh cement. It had to be set before others could leave their marks. Albert consolidated the docks, making sure every union boss, every foreman, every worker knew the chain of command ended with him. Those who hesitated were reminded, quietly and violently, of what had happened to the Manganos. The family's operations stretched across Brooklyn and Manhattan, into gambling, extortion, and loan sharking. But at its core, it was built on fear. And fear was the one commodity Albert had in limitless supply. The family began to change in ways that reflected his personality. Where Vincent Mangano had tried to rule with structure and tradition, Albert ruled with unpredictability. His temper became the family's rhythm, sudden and explosive, keeping even his closest men off balance. Loyalty wasn't just demanded, it was tested again and again. Soldiers lived knowing a minor slight, a careless word, could end them. In a world already defined by danger, Anastasia's rule added a layer of chaos that made survival even more precarious. Yet that chaos also inspired obedience. No one wanted to end up like the brothers. No one wanted to challenge the man who had turned on his own bosses and lived to claim their throne. By embracing violence so openly, Albert had crafted a family that was less about respect and more about fear. And in the short term, it worked. His family became one of the most disciplined, if brutal, in the city. But it wasn't only intimidation. Albert also reshaped the family into something sharper, more modern. He leaned on his alliance with Frank Costello, blending violence with politics. Costello's influence with judges and politicians gave Albert a shield against law enforcement, while Albert's reputation gave Costello the muscle to back his quiet negotiations. Together, they created a dynamic that blurred the line between legitimate influence and raw terror. The docks remained the centerpiece. With wartime shipping still fresh in memory and peacetime trade booming, the waterfront was a river of cash. Controlling it meant controlling the arteries of New York's economy. Workers paid kickbacks. Companies paid for peace. Strikes could be started or stopped at Albert's command. It gave him leverage not just over businesses, but over the city itself. He wielded that leverage like a blade, making sure everyone, from politicians to rival bosses, understood that his family was not to be underestimated. Inside the organization, Albert elevated men who mirrored his values. Killers rose in rank. Enforcers gained influence. To him, the family was not a place for schemers or dreamers. It was a machine built for violence, and only the most ruthless gears could turn within it. Soldiers who proved themselves loyal were rewarded with protection and opportunity. Those who faltered disappeared. The message was clear. In Anastasia's family, survival was not a guarantee. It was a privilege. But there was also a paradox at the heart of his rule. For all his brutality, Albert sought legitimacy. He had fought for his citizenship, served in the U.S. Army, and carried himself as both patriot and predator. Now, as boss, he wanted his family to command respect, not just fear. He spoke of expansion, of making the family one of the most powerful in the nation. To achieve that, he needed more than killers, he needed organization. So the family became a hybrid of both. On one hand, it was Murder Incorporated reborn, an army of executioners ready to enforce the syndicate's will. On the other, it was a business enterprise, laundering money, investing in ventures, blending underworld brutality with surface-level legitimacy. In many ways, it reflected the contradictions within Albert himself, violent yet ambitious, savage yet strategic, feared yet respected. The other bosses watched cautiously. Some admired his boldness, his refusal to be bound by tradition. Others distrusted him, wary of his temper, his unpredictability, his willingness to kill even his own superiors. To them, Albert was both asset and threat. The commission, always fragile, allowed him to keep his throne, but unease simmered beneath the surface. Men whispered that Anastasia's rule might not last forever, that one day his volatility would consume him. Yet for now, his family thrived. Money flowed. Fear spread. His name carried weight not only in New York, but across the country. The assassination of the Mangano brothers had not crippled him. It had elevated him. The family bore his name now, a lasting monument to the man who had seized power through blood. But monuments, no matter how imposing, cast shadows. And in those shadows, enemies plotted. Anastasia's rise had been meteoric, but meteors burn bright and fast. His family, reshaped in his image, reflected his strengths and his weaknesses. The violence that secured his power could also undermine it. The fear that silenced dissent could also breed betrayal. Albert Anastasia had achieved what few in the Mafia ever dared. He had killed his bosses, taken their throne, and carved an empire in his own likeness. For years, he had been the executioner for others. Now, he was executioner and king. But kings in the underworld rarely die peacefully. And as the family grew under his rule, the question lingered in every whispered conversation, in every wary glance. How long could a family built on fear survive before that fear turned inward? Chapter 18. Partnership with Carlo Gambino. The two men could not have been more different. One ruled through fear, his temper as sharp and unpredictable as a blade. The other built his power quietly, patient, cautious, a strategist who preferred whispers over bullets. And yet, in the early 1950s, Albert Anastasia and Carlo Gambino found themselves bound together, not by friendship, not by trust, but by necessity. It was a partnership born of calculation. Albert was now the undisputed head of his own family, having eliminated the Manganos and claimed their throne. His rule was absolute, but it was also fragile. His reputation terrified allies and rivals alike, yet that same volatility made him vulnerable. The Mafia, for all its blood, craved order, and order required balance. For Albert, that balance came in the form of Carlo Gambino. Gambino was everything Albert was not. He was calm, deliberate, almost invisible. Where Albert exploded in rages and left bodies behind, Gambino maneuvered quietly, accumulating influence without drawing headlines. His power grew not from fear, but from patience. He understood the long game, the art of letting others burn themselves out while he waited, silent, ready to claim the ashes. To outsiders, their alliance seemed natural. Both were ambitious. Both wanted their family strong. Both understood that survival in the Mafia meant unity. But beneath the surface, their bond was uneasy, riddled with mistrust. Albert needed Gambino's steady hand to temper his own volatility, to manage the parts of leadership that couldn't be enforced with violence. Gambino, in turn, needed Albert's muscle, his raw dominance, his reputation as the Lord High Executioner to keep rivals in check. Together, they presented a formidable front. Albert was the face of terror, Gambino the mind of strategy. One slammed the fist on the table, the other wrote the contract afterward. Their enemies, seeing no daylight between them, hesitated. The family, once destabilized by the Mangano brothers' disappearance, grew stronger under this balance of fear and calculation. But in the Mafia, alliances are never equal. They are scales, constantly tipping, constantly shifting. And from the beginning, Gambino had no illusions about Albert's flaws. He watched closely, noting every outburst, every reckless decision, every moment when Albert's temper threatened to undo what patience had built. To Gambino, Albert was both shield and liability. Useful, yes, but dangerous in ways that could not be controlled forever. Albert, for his part, must have sensed it. He was no fool. He knew Gambino was not a man to serve quietly. Behind the soft voice and modest demeanor was ambition as sharp as any blade. But perhaps Albert believed his own reputation was enough to keep Gambino in check. Perhaps he thought fear could bind a man who thrived on patience. If so, it was a miscalculation. Gambino feared nothing more than recklessness, and Albert embodied it. Still, in those early years, their partnership paid dividends. Together, they controlled the family's vast interests, gambling operations, union rackets, loan sharking networks. Gambino's low-key style smoothed relationships with other bosses, while Albert's brutality ensured loyalty within the ranks. It was a marriage of opposites, and for a time, it worked. The docks remained Albert's domain, his empire of sweat and cargo. Gambino, meanwhile, extended the family's reach into more discreet ventures, smuggling, loans, quiet investments that produced steady profits without drawing headlines. Where Albert sought to dominate, Gambino sought to endure. It was a difference in philosophy that mirrored their personalities. But philosophy in the Mafia is not an abstract thing. It shapes survival. Albert's philosophy was immediacy. Act now, strike hard, leave no room for doubt. Gambino's was patience. Wait, observe, let others destroy themselves. Together, they balanced each other, but only as long as their interests aligned. The cracks were subtle at first. Gambino would counsel restraint when Albert demanded action. Albert would grow impatient when Gambino urged diplomacy. Their men, loyal to one or the other, began to whisper. Some preferred Albert's fire, others admired Gambino's caution. And in the Mafia, whispers often become weapons. Law enforcement, watching from the outside, noted the unusual pairing. To detectives and prosecutors, it looked like strength, a violent boss tempered by a calculating underboss. But to those inside the underworld, it looked like inevitability. Two men so different, bound together by circumstance, could not remain aligned forever. One would eventually have to fall. Still, Albert leaned on Gambino in ways he may not have admitted. He had survived his entire career through force and fear, but being a boss required more than violence. It required diplomacy, subtlety, and understanding of politics both within and outside the Mafia. Gambino provided that. He navigated the commission, spoke softly in meetings, reassured allies wary of Anastasia's volatility. Without Gambino, Albert's rule might have collapsed under its own weight. But Gambino's patience was not loyalty. He played the long game, watching as Albert's temper alienated allies, as his unpredictability sowed unease among the other bosses. He knew time was on his side. Albert was fire. Fires burn bright, but they consumed themselves. Gambino was ice. He could wait forever. And so their partnership, while strong on the surface, was a quiet chess match beneath. Each move calculated, each gesture measured, each word weighed. Albert wielded fear like a hammer. Gambino wielded patience like a scalpel. Together, they built power. Separately, they prepared for the day when one would no longer need the other. For Albert, the alliance was a tool. For Gambino, it was an opportunity. And opportunities, in the Mafia, are always exploited. By 1952, the family was firmly under their joint control. Profits flowed, rivals hesitated, and for the moment, the balance held. But beneath that balance lay tension, as inevitable as gravity. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, ruled with fire and fear. Carlo Gambino, the quiet strategist, ruled with patience and calculation. Their alliance was real, but so was their mistrust. And in the Mafia, mistrust is never a question of if. It is always a question of when. Chapter 19, The Narcotics Question. The meeting room was thick with cigar smoke. The men seated around the long table spoke in low tones, their voices heavy with calculation. This was no casual gathering. It was a commission meeting, the high court of the Mafia. And the question on the table was one that would divide them for decades: narcotics. Should the syndicate plunge headfirst into the drug trade, with all the wealth it promised? Or should they draw a line, fearing the heat that heroin and cocaine would bring down on them? In that room, men leaned one way or the other. Some saw drugs as the future, an unstoppable river of money too big to ignore. Others, more cautious, saw it as poison, both for the addicts it created and for the Mafia itself. Once drugs were involved, they feared the law would come with a fury unlike anything they had faced before. Somewhere in that haze sat Albert Anastasia, his face carved in stone, his position ambiguous. Albert was not a man known for hesitation. His life had been defined by decisive violence, by striking first and leaving no doubt. But on the question of narcotics, he walked a careful line. On one hand, he understood the power of money. Drugs promised profits beyond anything gambling or labor racketeering could produce. He had seen the hunger of addicts, the way heroin turned men into desperate shells willing to pay anything for another fix. To a man like Albert, who had clawed his way from hunger and poverty, that kind of demand looked like opportunity. On the other hand, he knew the risks. Drugs brought chaos. They attracted attention not just from local cops, but from federal agents, men who wouldn't look the other way for a bribe or handshake. Albert had built his empire on fear, but fear worked best when it stayed in the shadows. Narcotics threatened to drag everything into the spotlight. And Albert knew better than most that the brighter the light, the shorter the life. Whispers in the underworld suggested that Albert played both sides. Some claimed he allowed his men to dabble in narcotics, skimming profits while keeping his own hands clean. Others insisted he forbade it outright, fearing the wrath it would bring. The truth, as with so much of his life, was murky. Perhaps even Albert himself hadn't made a final decision. Perhaps he was waiting to see which way the wind blew before committing fully. But the wind was shifting. By the early 1950s, heroin was flooding into American cities. The Mafia's control of shipping routes and contacts in Sicily made it the perfect middleman. The profits were staggering. Small-time gangsters who dipped their toes into the trade suddenly found themselves rich. Families who embraced it grew stronger, while those who resisted risked falling behind. For men like Vito Genovese, the choice was clear. Drugs were the future, and he wanted to be at the center of it. For men like Frank Costello, drugs were poison that would destroy the careful balance he had built with politicians and judges. And Albert Anastasia stood between them, his alliance with Costello pulling him one way, his own ambition tugging him the other. The ambiguity suited him for a time. It allowed him to maneuver, to play both sides without fully committing. But it also made him dangerous. In the Mafia, indecision could be fatal. Rivals whispered. Was Albert truly against drugs, or was he simply waiting to seize control of the trade himself? Distrust spread, suspicion grew, and in a world where perception was reality, the perception of duplicity was deadly. Meanwhile, the streets told their own story. Addicts multiplied. Arrests climbed. The newspapers began to connect drugs to organized crime, stoking public outrage. Politicians demanded action. Law enforcement shifted resources. And in the middle of it all, the Mafia grew richer and more exposed. Albert must have felt the tension tightening around him. He was a man who had built his life on blood, but money had always been his true motive. Drugs tempted him, but he had seen what happened when temptation went too far. Bugsy Siegel's ambition in Las Vegas had ended with bullets. Would narcotics do the same to him? Some accounts suggest Albert eventually allowed his men to deal in drugs as long as they were discreet, taking his cut while insisting on deniability. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. To drug advocates, it was too timid. To drug opponents, it was too reckless. To law enforcement, it was confirmation that the Lord High Executioner's empire was tied to the poison flooding the streets. The question of narcotics was more than business. It was a test of leadership. Could Albert adapt to the new world the Mafia was entering? Could he balance ambition with caution, greed with survival? Or would his ambiguity leave him vulnerable to men who had already made up their minds? Behind closed doors, his enemies took note. Gambino, patient as ever, saw Albert's uncertainty as weakness. Genovese, hungry for power, saw it as opportunity. Costello, worried about his political shield, saw it as liability. Each man, in his own way, began to calculate a future where Albert Anastasia's position was no longer secure. The irony was bitter. Albert, the man who had built his empire on decisiveness, on violent clarity, now found himself paralyzed by ambiguity. The Lord High Executioner, who had once struck without hesitation, now hesitated. And in the Mafia, hesitation was as deadly as betrayal. The narcotics question would never be settled cleanly. The Mafia would fracture over it, some families diving headfirst into the trade, others resisting, all of them touched by the profits and the risks. Albert's stance, whatever it truly was, would remain a point of debate. But in the end, what mattered wasn't the clarity of his position. It was the perception that he was vulnerable, uncertain, and perhaps out of step with the future. For Albert Anastasia, that perception would prove fatal. Chapter 20. Public outrage and press attention. The camera flash cracked like gunfire, flooding the courtroom with light. Albert Anastasia sat in his chair, jaw tight, eyes cold, unflinching under the glare. The reporters scribbled furiously, their pencils scratching the paper almost as quickly as the shutters clicked. In their notebooks and in the morning headlines, Albert was no longer just a Mafia boss. He was the Lord High Executioner, the embodiment of organized crime's darkest face. For years, Anastasia had thrived in the shadows. He killed in silence, ruled through whispers, and let fear do most of his talking. But by the mid-1950s, the press had dragged him out of the darkness and into the spotlight. Suddenly, the public knew his name. His face was plastered across newspapers, his reputation dissected in magazine articles, his every move framed as proof of America's underworld nightmare. The media painted him as a monster. They called him ruthless, unpredictable, a man whose hands were drenched in blood. Some accounts exaggerated, others invented details outright, but the truth hardly mattered. The narrative was set. Albert Anastasia was not just another gangster. He was the gangster, the face of Murder Incorporated, the killer who turned backroom whispers into gunfire. It wasn't only the press. Ordinary people, reading about him at breakfast tables or listening to radio broadcasts, began to use his name the way they once used Capone's. He became a symbol of everything frightening about the Mafia. Parents warned their children not to say his name too loudly. Neighbors whispered if he was spotted near their block. To the public, he was no longer a man. He was a myth of violence given flesh. Albert must have felt the weight of it. For a man who had spent decades pulling strings from the shadows, invisibility had been his shield. Now, that shield was gone. Every headline drew more attention from law enforcement. Every sensational story pushed prosecutors to act. Politicians, desperate to appear tough on crime, held up his name as proof of the Mafia's evil. He was no longer feared only by his enemies. He was feared by America. The irony was sharp. In the Mafia, fear was his greatest weapon. But in the public eye, fear became a liability. It meant more surveillance, more scrutiny, more heat. For every soldier who trembled under his gaze, there was now a detective ready to tail him, a prosecutor sharpening an indictment, a journalist eager to sell the next lurid tale. The press feasted on the contradictions of his character. They wrote about his violent rages, about the rumors of him killing men for minor slights, about his role in the Mangano brothers' disappearance. They tied him to Bugsy Siegel's assassination, to dozens of unsolved murders, to every bloody shadow in New York. Some articles described him as a mad dog, a man too unstable to be reasoned with. Others portrayed him as a calculating tyrant, using terror as currency. Both images stuck, and both fueled public outrage. The courtroom sketches of Albert from this era tell their own story. He sits upright, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady. He rarely smiles, rarely flinches, rarely betrays anything human. To the public, those sketches looked like confirmation of the stories. To them, he wasn't just silent. He was cold, detached, the very definition of a killer. Inside the underworld, the press coverage was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it amplified his reputation. Fear spread beyond the Mafia itself, turning him into a legend that cowed even those who had never met him. On the other hand, it painted a target on his back. The Mafia thrived on invisibility, on being everywhere and nowhere at once. Albert's fame violated that unwritten rule. Even his allies began to worry. Men like Frank Costello, who relied on subtlety and political connections, cringed at the headlines. They knew every article about Anastasia risked drawing attention to the entire syndicate. Carlo Gambino, patient and calculating, watched as Albert's notoriety grew, knowing that the brighter the spotlight, the shorter the reign. But Albert didn't change. If anything, he leaned into the image. He carried himself with the same mix of arrogance and indifference, as though daring the world to challenge him. Maybe he believed his reputation was untouchable, that fear could shield him as it always had. Or maybe, beneath the surface, he was too proud, or too stubborn, to admit that the tide was turning. The public outrage reached a peak after stories of Murder Incorporated resurfaced in trials and testimonies. Witnesses spoke of hundreds of killings, of a syndicate of executioners overseen by Anastasia himself. Though many details were exaggerated, the core truth was undeniable. Albert had presided over an era of violence unlike anything the city had seen. The press seized on the Lord High Executioner nickname, printing it again and again, hammering it into the public consciousness until it seemed inseparable from his identity. To the American public, he became a kind of boogeyman. In a time when crime stories filled newspapers like serialized novels, Albert's life was the ultimate tale. Immigrant beginnings, brutal rise, countless bodies, and now a throne dripping with blood. Hollywood didn't need to invent villains when the real thing lived in New York. For Albert, the coverage was more than nuisance, it was dangerous. Every headline hardened the resolve of law enforcement. Every editorial calling for justice put pressure on prosecutors. Every whisper about his brutality gave his enemies ammunition to use against him. In the Mafia, invisibility was survival. Albert had lost it. And yet, there was something almost inevitable about his fame. From the docks of Brooklyn to the chair in that courtroom, Albert had lived by violence. He had courted fear, thrived on it, used it as both sword and shield. Perhaps it was only natural that the fear he created eventually spilled into the open, into headlines, into public outrage. His legacy had outgrown the shadows. But legends are fragile. They make men appear invincible, but they also make them targets. As the public cursed his name and the press called him ruthless, his rivals took note. The more famous Albert became, the more dangerous it was to be allied with him. His unpredictability, his temper, his notoriety, all of it made him vulnerable. For the first time, the Lord High Executioner's greatest weapon, fear, was no longer working in his favor. It was turning against him, fueling the very forces that would one day bring him down. And in those smoke-filled commission meetings, behind guarded words and careful glances, men were already asking the question, how long could Albert Anastasia survive with the world watching his every move? Chapter 21, Vito Genovese Moves. The whispers started long before the bullets flew. In the smoky corners of restaurants, in the backrooms of clubs, in the hushed tones of men who knew better than to say too much. The whispers all carried the same name, Vito Genovese. By the mid-1950s, he had returned from exile in Italy and was hungry. Hungry for power. Hungry to reclaim what prison and deportation had stolen from him. And in his eyes, two men stood in the way of his rise, Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia. Genovese was the opposite of subtle. He was bold, calculating, ruthless. He had no patience for diplomacy, no interest in political shields. He didn't care about handshakes with senators or quiet deals with judges. What he wanted was control, absolute, unchallenged, unbreakable. And to get it, he had to remove the two men who embodied the balance of power in New York. Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, represented politics, influence, and order. His partnership with Albert was the glue holding the syndicate together. Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, represented fear, unpredictability, and violence. Together, they made an alliance that was difficult to challenge. Costello provided protection in courtrooms. Anastasia provided protection on the streets. Genovese understood that if he wanted to rule, he had to break that bond. So he began to plot. The plan wasn't just about killing. Genovese knew the Mafia was a system. Power wasn't seized with a single act. It was seized by shifting allegiances, by making men believe the tide had turned, by convincing soldiers and capos that survival meant choosing the winning side. And so, quietly, patiently, Genovese worked the angles. He whispered to bosses who resented Costello's political posturing, who believed his influence had softened the Mafia into a gentleman's club. He whispered to those who feared Anastasia's temper, who worried his unpredictability would draw too much heat. He promised them a return to tradition, a Mafia ruled not by politics or chaos, but by raw, disciplined power. The whispers grew. Some men nodded in agreement, others in fear. But all of them listened. And in the underworld, listening was the first step toward betrayal. Albert, for all his ferocity, must have sensed it. He wasn't blind to politics. He knew Genovese was moving, knew alliances were shifting, knew the ground beneath his feet was no longer as solid as it once seemed. But what could he do? His weapon was fear, not diplomacy. Fear could silence dissent, but it could not erase ambition. And Genovese's ambition was a force even fear struggled to contain. Costello, too, must have felt it. His empire of political connections depended on stability, on quiet deals behind closed doors. Genovese threatened all of that. But Costello was aging. The years of navigating between lawmen and mobsters had taken their toll. He was tired. And in the Mafia, tired men don't last long. For Genovese, the first target was obvious. Costello. Removing him would shatter the alliance, leaving Anastasia exposed. Without Costello's political shield, Albert would be vulnerable, a giant standing alone, feared but isolated. It was strategy, pure and cold. Strike at the brain before you strike at the fist. And so, in 1957, the plot against Costello took shape. Gunmen were chosen. Plans were laid. The goal was not just murder, but humiliation. To show the Mafia that Costello, the so-called prime minister, was mortal. That Genovese was the future. That fear had found a new face. But what about Albert? His name, too, echoed in Genovese's plans. Killing Costello was step one. Removing Anastasia was step two. And everyone knew it. Albert himself knew it. He was too experienced, too scarred by betrayal, not to feel the knife pressing against his back. Yet he stood his ground. Because for Albert Anastasia, standing down was never an option. He had lived his entire life striking first. The irony was bitter. Now, for perhaps the first time, he hesitated. The underworld watched with unease. Men who had once spoken confidently now lowered their voices. The balance of power was tilting. Some still feared Anastasia's rage. Others began to hedge their bets, aligning themselves with Genovese in case Albert fell. It was a dangerous waiting game, one where loyalty was less about honor and more about survival. The press, as always, smelled blood. Articles hinted at a mafia civil war, at cracks within the syndicate. Reporters didn't know the details, but they could feel the tremors. And those tremors reached the public, feeding the image of a city balanced on the edge of violence. For Albert, the danger was not just Genovese, it was isolation. His reputation, once his greatest strength, now made him vulnerable. Allies feared standing too close. Rivals sharpened their knives. And men who had once admired his ruthlessness began to wonder if it was finally catching up to him. Genovese, patient and relentless, pressed on. His move against Costello would be bold, public, undeniable. It would send shockwaves through the underworld, rippling outward to touch every corner of the commission. And when the dust settled, he expected to stand unchallenged. But the thing about plotting in the Mafia is that nothing is ever certain. Bullets miss. Loyalties shift. Reputations endure longer than expected. Albert Anastasia was still the Lord High Executioner, still a man whose shadow terrified even hardened killers. Costello, though weary, still commanded loyalty among men who valued order over chaos. Genovese's plan was daring, but daring plans often come with consequences no one can predict. The stage was set. Costello would be tested. Albert would be cornered. And the Mafia itself would face a reckoning that would decide not just who ruled, but what kind of empire it would become. The whispers had turned into open plotting. And in the smoke-filled rooms of New York, one truth became undeniable. Vito Genovese was moving. And once he moved, the blood would follow. Chapter 22. The Attack on Frank Costello, 1957. The lobby lights glowed dimly, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, stepped out of the elevator and adjusted his coat. It was May of 1957, and though his age had slowed him, his influence still carried weight. He had survived decades in the Mafia not by bullets, but by brains. That night, however, brains would not be enough. A man waited in the hall. A pistol rose. The silence of the building shattered with the crack of a gunshot. The bullet grazed Costello's head, tearing a line across his scalp, sending him stumbling forward. Blood trickled down his face as he clutched the wound, his eyes wide with shock. He did not fall. He did not die. The would-be assassin fled, leaving Costello alive but forever changed. The attempt was no random act of violence. It was a message. Vito Genovese had made his move. For months, he had plotted to unseat Costello, to break apart the fragile balance that had kept the Mafia in check. This was the strike meant to finish it. A clean kill would have left Costello's throne vacant, leaving Anastasia isolated, his greatest ally gone. But the bullet missed its mark. And in that miss, the Mafia's future turned uncertain. Costello survived, but survival came with consequences. The attack rattled him. The man who had spent years maneuvering in shadows, greasing politicians, and protecting his empire through diplomacy now felt vulnerable. For the first time, he seemed weary of the life, weary of the endless battles, weary of the constant threat. His injury was minor, but the wound to his confidence was deep. The newspapers feasted on the story. Headlines screamed of the brazen attack, of the Mafia war spilling into Manhattan streets. Sketches of Costello with a bandaged head filled the front pages. Reporters speculated about rivalries, about the shadow of Genovese, about the shaky alliances that held New York's underworld together. The public, once only dimly aware of Costello's influence, now knew him as the man who had survived an assassin's bullet. But inside the Mafia, the implications were far darker. To survive an assassination attempt was not always a victory. Sometimes it was worse than dying. Survival raised questions. Did Costello still have the strength to rule? Would his allies stand beside a man who had been marked for death? Would his enemies strike again, this time without missing? Costello's answer came quietly. He began to withdraw. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, carefully, like a man slipping out of a burning building. He reduced his role in decision-making, passed responsibilities to others, and distanced himself from the daily grind of power. It was not surrender, exactly, it was fatigue. He had built an empire of politics and influence, but now, with blood still drying on his scalp, he no longer had the appetite to defend it. For Albert Anastasia, the attack was a thunderclap. Costello was more than an ally. He was a shield, a partner, the man whose political connections gave Albert cover from law enforcement. Together, they had balanced each other, Costello with influence, Albert with fear. But now that balance was broken. Costello was alive, but diminished, and Albert was suddenly exposed. He must have felt it immediately, the shift in power, the ground moving beneath his feet. Genovese had not killed Costello, but he had wounded him in ways more profound than a bullet could. With Costello fading, Albert stood alone at the top of a family built on violence, his temper unchecked, his enemies multiplying. The commission took note. Other bosses, once wary of challenging Albert, now began to whisper. His reputation as the Lord High Executioner still commanded fear, but fear without allies is fragile. Men began to consider whether aligning with Genovese, or even Gambino, might be safer in the long run. The Mafia thrived on perception, and the perception now was that Albert Anastasia was vulnerable. The irony was cruel. Costello had survived, but his survival weakened both him and Albert. If he had died, Albert might have been galvanized, striking back with the full force of his reputation. But with Costello retreating, Albert was left to fight battles on his own. Battles he could not win with fear alone. Law enforcement, too, smelled blood in the water. The attack confirmed what they had long suspected, that the Mafia was at war with itself. Prosecutors tightened their grip. Detectives leaned harder on informants. The press painted a picture of chaos, of an underworld tearing itself apart. And in that chaos, Albert's name appeared again and again, not as survivor, but as target. The gunman who had tried to kill Costello was never caught, but everyone knew who was behind it. Genovese's fingerprints were all over the plot. His ambition was no longer whispered, it was undeniable. He had struck at the heart of the old order and lived to see it stumble. Now he turned his gaze toward Anastasia. For Albert, the attack on Costello marked the beginning of the end. His family was strong, his fearsome reputation intact, but the balance of power had shifted. Without Costello, his political shield was gone. Without Costello, his enemies grew bolder. Without Costello, the Lord High Executioner stood on a throne surrounded by knives. And somewhere in the shadows, Vito Genovese sharpened the next blade. Chapter 23, Enemies Closing In. The whispers were no longer whispers. By late 1957, they were currents running beneath every conversation in the Mafia. Men who once flinched at the sound of Albert Anastasia's name now dared to speak it aloud, followed by words like unstable, reckless, dangerous. He had ruled with fear for decades, but fear has a half-life. And when allies began to fear that his volatility would consume them too, fear became the seed of betrayal. Somewhere in Manhattan's smoky restaurants and Brooklyn's hidden meeting rooms, a pact was taking shape. It was not declared openly, nor sealed with handshakes under bright lights. It formed in glances, in silences, in cautious words exchanged between men who shared a common calculation. Vito Genovese, hungry for power, and Carlo Gambino, patient as stone, had found each other. Together, they saw a future without the Lord High Executioner. For Gambino, the alliance was the natural conclusion of years spent watching Albert erupt. He had stood beside him, managed his family's business with quiet precision, balanced his temper with patience. But Gambino was not a man who tolerated instability for long. He wanted order, longevity, control built on subtlety, not spectacle. Anastasia's rages, his murders over minor slights, his growing notoriety in the press, they threatened everything Gambino was building. To remain aligned with him meant inheriting his chaos. Gambino preferred to inherit his crown. For Genovese, the motive was simpler. Albert stood between him and complete control of the commission. The attempt on Frank Costello had shaken the old order, but as long as Anastasia breathed, the path was blocked. Genovese wanted power that stretched across the city, unchallenged. And to achieve it, Anastasia had to die. The alignment of the two men was a dangerous alchemy. Genovese brought ambition, Gambino brought patience. One was fire, the other ice. Together, they became inevitability. The irony was sharp. Anastasia had always believed fear would keep him safe. He killed his rivals before they could kill him. He struck first, never doubting that violence was the answer to betrayal. But now his enemies were men who did not fear him the way others did. Genovese had the arrogance of a man who believed his destiny was power. Gambino had the patience of a man who knew time was always on his side. Fear worked on the weak. These two were not weak. Albert must have felt the walls closing in. He was not a politician, but he understood the rhythm of power. He saw the way men avoided his gaze, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. He must have noticed Gambino's silence, the way his once loyal partner now spoke less, watched more. He must have heard the whispers of Genovese's ascendance. For a man who had lived by striking first, hesitation was poison. And yet, for reasons history still debates, he did not strike. Perhaps he believed his reputation was enough. Perhaps he thought no one would dare challenge the Lord High Executioner. Perhaps, after decades of blood, even Albert Anastasia had grown tired of looking over his shoulder. But his enemies had already made their choice. The plan took shape quietly, deliberately. Gambino, with his insider's knowledge of Anastasia's habits, provided the subtle push. Genovese, with his ambition, gave the green light. And in the shadows, soldiers loyal to them prepared for the moment. It would not be a war. It would be surgical, swift, final, undeniable. The kind of act that left no room for doubt. Inside the family, loyalties shifted like sand. Some men clung to Albert, fearful of his wrath if they betrayed him. Others, sensing the tide, drifted toward Gambino. Survival in the Mafia was not about loyalty, it was about calculation. And by the fall of 1957, the calculation was clear: Anastasia's time was ending. Meanwhile, the world outside the Mafia played its part. Newspapers continued to paint Albert as the symbol of organized crime's brutality. Politicians called for crackdowns. Law enforcement circled, emboldened by public outrage. The more famous he became, the more isolated he was. For men like Gambino and Genovese, this made the timing perfect. They would not only rid themselves of a rival, they would rid the Mafia of a liability. And Albert himself gave them the opening. His routines were predictable. His arrogance made him careless. He still believed he could sit in a barber's chair, relax for a shave, and trust that no one would dare touch him. To his enemies, it was the perfect stage. A man who had killed so many in cold blood would meet his end not on the battlefield, but in a chair, cape draped across his chest, utterly exposed. The betrayal was not yet spoken aloud, but it was already real. In hushed tones, Gambino and Genovese's men aligned their pieces, ensuring the commission would not intervene, ensuring that when Albert fell, no one would rise to defend him. It was the quiet kind of war, one fought not with open violence, but with whispers, nods, and a single inevitable decision. For decades, Albert Anastasia had been the storm, the man who struck first, who terrified rivals, who silenced dissent. Now, the storm was being surrounded by silence. Silence more dangerous than bullets. Silence that meant isolation. Silence that meant death. And in the fall of 1957, that silence was almost complete. The Lord High Executioner had built his empire on fear. But fear, at last, was no longer enough. The enemies were closing in. Chapter 24, The Barbershop Hit, October 25, 1957. The hiss of steam rose from the towel warmer. The faint hum of a razor being sharpened on leather filled the air. It was an ordinary morning at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. The barbershop smelled of talc and aftershave, a clean, sharp scent masking the tension that no one in the room could sense, but would soon arrive like thunder. Albert Anastasia settled into the chair, the cape drawn tight around his chest, the leather cool against his back. He leaned into the ritual, eyes half closed as the barber tucked a towel under his chin. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by danger, who had watched friends and rivals cut down in the most brutal ways, a barber's chair should have been the most vulnerable place in the world. Yet here he sat, relaxed, trusting, perhaps believing his reputation still protected him. Outside, in the lobby of the hotel, two men waited. Their suits were plain, their hats low. To the casual eye, they were just customers heading in for a trim. But inside their coats, beneath the fabric, they carried pistols. Their orders were clear. Their target sat in the chair, a white towel draped across his chest. The seconds ticked by. The barber adjusted his tools, dipped his brush into warm lather, and worked the foam into a thick cloud. The steam softened Albert's skin. The razor gleamed under the light. It was a picture of calm, a scene repeated in 1,000 shops across the city. No one could know that the room itself was about to become a tomb. The door creaked open. The two men stepped inside. The bell above the frame chimed softly, a sound so ordinary it barely registered. The barber looked up briefly, then returned to his work. Albert, his face half covered in shaving cream, glanced into the mirror. He saw movement, two figures behind him, distorted in the glass. Then came the guns. The first shot shattered the stillness, the echo slamming against the tiled walls. The mirror cracked as bullets tore through it, glass exploding across the floor. Albert lurched forward, his body jerking under the impact. More shots followed, rapid, relentless. The barber dove to the floor, covering his head, the scent of gunpowder mixing with the sharp sweetness of aftershave. Albert staggered, his hands clawing at the cape that bound him to the chair. Disoriented, bleeding, he fought to rise. Some say he lunged toward the mirror, as if attacking his own reflection. Others claim he tried to stand, to face his killers head-on, refusing to collapse like a victim. The truth lies somewhere in the blur of violence, but one thing is certain. The Lord High Executioner did not die quietly. Bullets riddled his body, tearing through flesh and fabric, punching holes into the once pristine cape. Blood spattered across the mirror, streaking the reflection with red. The chair tipped as his weight shifted, crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs, leather, and shattered glass. The killers did not linger. Their work was precise, rehearsed, final. They slipped back through the door, leaving behind a barbershop drenched in silence except for the drip of blood and the ragged breath of the terrified barber. Outside, they melted into the city, swallowed by crowds, leaving only death in their wake. Albert Anastasia, the man who had ordered hundreds of executions, who had ruled through fear, who had silenced so many with his violence, now lay sprawled on the floor of a midtown barbershop. His empire ended not with a war, not with a courtroom conviction, But with the crack of pistols and the indifference of men who saw him as an obstacle to be removed, the news spread within minutes. Radios blared the headlines. Mafia boss gunned down in Manhattan. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. The image of the blood-stained barbershop became one of the most infamous in organized crime history, a symbol of how even the most feared executioner could not escape execution himself. Inside the underworld, the message was unmistakable. Fear had failed him. His reputation, once his shield, had turned brittle. Men who once trembled at his name had joined forces to erase him. Genovese had moved. Gambino had betrayed. The commission had turned its head. Albert was alone. In the aftermath, theories swirled. Who exactly had pulled the triggers? Some pointed to soldiers loyal to Gambino, others to men connected to Genovese. The names mattered less than the fact itself. His enemies had aligned, and his death had been sanctioned at the highest levels. This was not a rogue hit. It was an execution by consensus. For the men who had once served under him, the assassination was both terror and relief. Terror, because it proved no one, not even Albert Anastasia, was untouchable. Relief, because his rages, his volatility, his unpredictability were gone. The family he had reshaped in his image would now pass into calmer, colder hands. The public, meanwhile, devoured the story. Photographs of the crime scene splashed across front pages. The irony was irresistible. The Lord High Executioner, killed while receiving a shave. It was a headline too cinematic for even Hollywood to invent. Commentators painted it as poetic justice, a man who had lived by violence dying in the very act of ordinary vulnerability. But there was nothing poetic for Albert in those final moments. There was only confusion, betrayal, and the shock of discovering that fear was not enough to save him. He had spent decades believing that his ruthlessness would shield him from betrayal. Instead, it had isolated him, made him the one man no one wanted to protect. The barbershop floor became the stage for one of the Mafia's most infamous endings. A boss who had once ruled through terror, brought down not by courage or rebellion, but by careful plotting and inevitable betrayal. His killers vanished into the anonymity of the city. His family shifted seamlessly into new leadership. And Albert Anastasia, once untouchable, became a headline, a cautionary tale, a symbol of the truth every gangster learns too late. No throne in the underworld is permanent. The echoes of those gunshots carried far beyond the Park Sheraton. They reverberated through the commission, through the streets of New York, through the psyche of every man who thought himself untouchable. If Albert Anastasia could be killed, anyone could. And in the silence that followed, one question lingered like smoke in the air. If the Lord High Executioner could not protect himself, who in the Mafia ever truly could? Chapter 25, Panic in the Mafia. The morning after Albert Anastasia's body hit the barbershop floor, the underworld of New York felt different. Streets that usually buzzed with quiet confidence were suddenly heavy with unease. Men who had walked with swagger now glanced over their shoulders. The news spread faster than the gunshots that had killed him. The Lord High Executioner was gone. And if he could be killed, then no one was safe. The barbershop hit was not just another mob murder. It was a thunderclap. Anastasia had been more than a boss. He was a force, a living myth. His rages were infamous, his reputation lethal. For decades, he had been the figure others invoked to keep their soldiers in line. Remember what happened to the last man who crossed Albert? That kind of warning didn't require explanation. Now, the myth had shattered in a spray of blood and broken glass. In neighborhoods across Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx, whispers carried like smoke. Who had sanctioned it? Who had dared? Some swore it was Gambino. Others said Genovese had orchestrated it. A few even muttered about the commission as a whole, tired of Albert's volatility. But in truth, the details didn't matter. What mattered was the message. If Albert Anastasia could be taken down in broad daylight, in the middle of Manhattan, then anyone could. That realization sent ripples of fear through the Mafia. Capos who had once felt secure in their territories began holding meetings in more secretive spots, avoiding their usual clubs and restaurants. Soldiers kept their hands close to their jackets, suspicious of every car that slowed near a curb. Paranoia spread faster than loyalty, and in the underworld, paranoia could kill quicker than bullets. Law enforcement seized the moment. The press painted the barbershop murder as proof of a mafia war, splashing gruesome details across front pages. Politicians thundered about cracking down. Detectives trailed suspects more aggressively, raiding gambling dens, shaking down union bosses. The public, fascinated and horrified, devoured every headline. To them, the mafia was no longer invisible. It was a beast eating itself in plain sight. Inside the syndicate, the shockwaves were even greater. Some men felt relief. Anastasia's unpredictability had made him as dangerous to allies as to enemies. He had ruled by fear, and fear, over time, had eroded loyalty. His death meant a chance for calmer leadership, for stability. Others felt dread. If the commission could allow, or even approve, his murder, then the rules were more fragile than they appeared. Meetings grew tense. Trust evaporated. Men eyed each other across tables, wondering who might be next. The barbershop hit had stripped away illusions. No one, not even the Lord High Executioner, was untouchable. And when untouchable men fall, everyone else feels the tremor. Albert's own family was thrown into disarray. Soldiers who had once sworn loyalty began shifting toward Gambino, sensing the future belonged to him. Some were torn. Fear of Albert's ghost still hung heavy, but fear of being on the wrong side of history was stronger. In the Mafia, survival always outweighed sentiment. And survival meant adapting quickly to new realities. But adaptation came with its own dangers. Men who switched loyalties too fast risked being branded opportunists. Men who hesitated risked being seen as traitors. It was a delicate dance, one misstep away from death. The panic that swept through the family was not just fear of betrayal. It was fear of being perceived as disloyal, even by accident. For the rank and file, the lesson was brutal. Power was fragile. One day you stood beside a man believed invincible. The next you were scrambling to find protection from the knives pointed in every direction. Loyalty, respect, reputation, all of it could vanish in the time it took to fire a pistol. In coffee shops and pool halls, soldiers lowered their voices to whispers. They asked questions no one could answer. Who had given the shooters their orders? How much longer would the bloodletting last? Was this the beginning of a war, or the end of one? Each question hung in the air like smoke, suffocating, heavy, impossible to clear. Even Gambino, the patient strategist who benefited most, understood the danger of the moment. He had gained control, yes, but he had gained it through betrayal and blood. And betrayal leaves scars. Men might accept his leadership, but they would also remember how he came to power. His reign, from the very first day, carried the shadow of the barbershop floor. Genovese, too, must have felt the weight of the moment. He had orchestrated Costello's fall and helped push Anastasia to his end. But he also knew the Mafia was not built on quick victories. It was built on perception, on long-term control. The panic spreading through the underworld was useful to him, but it was also unpredictable. Too much fear could make men turn on each other. And chaos, once unleashed, was hard to control. For law enforcement, the assassination provided ammunition. They pointed to the panic as proof that the Mafia was vulnerable, tearing itself apart. For the public, it became another bloody story in the saga of organized crime. A saga that was beginning to look less like invincibility and more like self-destruction. But for the men inside the life, panic meant paralysis. Do you attend the next meeting, knowing it could be a trap? Do you trust the man sitting across from you, knowing he might already be aligned with someone else? Do you speak too much, risking exposure, or stay too quiet, risking suspicion? These were the questions that kept gangsters awake at night in the weeks after Albert's death. The shockwaves didn't end with his family. Across the 5 families, bosses and underbosses recalibrated. Territories shifted, alliances bent. Everyone asked the same question in private. If Anastasia could be erased so cleanly, so quickly, who would be next? And in those hushed conversations, one truth became unavoidable. The Mafia had always preached the illusion of rules, of order, of respect. But the barbershop hit had revealed the reality. Beneath the veneer, it was still a jungle. Kill or be killed. Fear or be forgotten. Albert Anastasia had ruled through terror, believing terror would protect him. But in the end, terror had isolated him. And isolation, in the Mafia, was a death sentence. In the weeks that followed, men across New York checked their rearview mirrors a little more often. They lingered at doorways before stepping inside. They sat in silence, wondering if their name was already being whispered in someone else's ear. The barbershop hit had not just killed the boss. It had killed the illusion of safety. And as the panic deepened, another question began to fester in the minds of every man still breathing in the underworld. If even the Lord High Executioner could not escape his own execution, how much time did the rest of them truly have? Chapter 26. Carlo Gambino takes over. The barbershop floor was still stained with blood when Carlo Gambino began his quiet rise. The newspapers had splashed Albert Anastasia's death across front pages. The public gawked at the brutality of the hit, and the underworld buzzed with fear. But while others panicked, Gambino remained calm. He had waited for this moment for years, perhaps even engineered it. Now, with Albert gone, he moved with the patience of a man who understood that true power is not seized in chaos. It is inherited in silence. There was no coronation, no dramatic announcement. Gambino didn't need one. The very absence of Anastasia was his declaration. Soldiers, capos, and underbosses who had once walked in fear of Albert now drifted toward the man who had helped orchestrate his fall. They didn't flock to Gambino out of loyalty or admiration. They came because he represented survival. In the Mafia, survival is stronger than loyalty. Gambino was unlike the boss who came before him. Albert had been a storm, violent, unpredictable, striking with thunder and lightning to remind men of his power. Gambino was fog, quiet, deliberate, seeping into every corner without ever raising his voice. He didn't need to rage, didn't need to spill blood recklessly. His genius lay in restraint, in making violence so precise, so surgical, that it never attracted unnecessary attention. The family Albert had shaped in his own brutal image was now in Gambino's hands. He wasted no time reshaping it again, molding it into something that reflected his philosophy. Gone were the chaotic outbursts, the killings over trivial insults. Gambino valued order, discipline, and above all, invisibility. The Mafia was meant to operate like a shadow government, powerful, profitable, but unseen. Albert's flamboyance had drawn too much light. Gambino dimmed it. On the streets, men quickly noticed the difference. Meetings no longer erupted into shouts or sudden violence. Business was handled quietly, efficiently. Gambino didn't tolerate recklessness, but unlike Albert, he didn't need to terrify his men into obedience. His power was subtler. He created an environment where betrayal seemed not only suicidal, but unnecessary. Under Gambino, there was enough profit to go around. And profit, when distributed wisely, keeps soldiers loyal in ways fear never could. The docks, long a stronghold of Anastasia's power, remained under the family's grip. But Gambino expanded the focus, branching further into unions, gambling, and construction rackets. Where Albert had built his empire on intimidation, Gambino layered it with patience. He wove connections into every corner of the city, ensuring the family's power was not just muscle but influence. Judges, politicians, businessmen, all found themselves tied to Gambino's quiet hand. It was a transformation not just of a family, but of the Mafia itself. With Anastasia gone, the age of the Lord High Executioner was over. In its place came an era of careful calculation. Gambino understood that violence was a tool, but not the foundation. The foundation was money. And money, unlike bullets, never left bodies in barber shops. But for all his subtlety, Gambino's takeover was not without unease. Men remembered how he had come to power, through betrayal. They whispered about his role in Anastasia's death, even as they followed him. They knew that if he could orchestrate the fall of the Lord High Executioner, he could orchestrate the fall of anyone. That fear kept them loyal, but it also reminded them of the cold calculation at the heart of his rule. Gambino was not just a boss. He was a survivor. And survival, in his world, meant being willing to sacrifice anyone. Genovese, meanwhile, watched from his own throne, satisfied. Anastasia's removal had been a victory for him as much as for Gambino. But the alliance between the two men was one of convenience, not trust. Genovese wanted control of the commission. Gambino wanted longevity. Their partnership was less a bond than a truce, and in the Mafia, truces never last forever. Still, for the moment, Gambino's rise reshaped the landscape. The panic that had swept through the underworld after Anastasia's death began to settle. Men adjusted to the new reality. The five families recalibrated, each boss testing the waters, measuring Gambino's approach. What they saw was a man who valued quiet, who avoided unnecessary wars, who sought profit above spectacle. It was a style many could live with. And so, with barely a ripple, Carlo Gambino took control. He inherited not only Anastasia's family, but his seat on the commission. He inherited the unions, the rackets, the networks of influence Albert had built. But most of all, he inherited the lesson Albert had failed to learn. Fear alone could not sustain power. Fear could isolate, expose, and eventually destroy. True power came from making men believe they were safer with you than without you. Gambino made them believe it. Yet beneath the calm surface, uncertainty lingered. Gambino had gained control, but in gaining it, he had revealed the truth about the Mafia's nature. Bosses could be betrayed. Legends could be erased. Empires could be reshaped overnight. The barbershop floor was proof of that. The men who followed Gambino did so with respect, but also with caution. They knew the throne he now occupied had once belonged to the Lord High Executioner, and they knew how quickly a throne could turn into a coffin. In the end, Gambino's rise marked the dawn of a new era. The Mafia was no longer ruled by thunder and lightning. It was ruled by fog, quiet, steady, invisible, but everywhere. Carlo Gambino had taken over, and the modern Mafia, as the world would come to know it, bore his imprint. But in the shadows of that triumph, one truth remained unspoken. Power, no matter how carefully held, is always borrowed. And someday, someone else would come to collect. Chapter 27. The Violent Legacy of the Executioner. The barber's chair was still tilted sideways, its leather ripped and soaked, when detectives crowded the room with their notepads and flashbulbs. Outside, reporters shouted over one another, desperate for a glimpse of the crime scene. Inside, Albert Anastasia lay sprawled on the floor, the Lord High Executioner reduced to another body. For decades, his name had been synonymous with terror. Now, his blood stained the tiles like anyone else's. In that moment, the myth collapsed into reality. Albert had spent his life building an empire out of fear. From the Brooklyn docks to the back rooms of the commission, his presence was a weapon. His violent temper kept his men in line. His reputation silenced rivals before they could act. He was not subtle, not strategic, not patient. He was raw force, a blade that cut quickly and deeply. But force, no matter how sharp, eventually dulls. And Albert's death was proof. The Mafia had always lived by its own paradox. Rules meant to create order in a world defined by blood. Men swore oaths, kissed rings, obeyed traditions. Yet when power tilted, those same rules bent or shattered. Anastasia himself had risen by breaking them, killing his bosses and claiming their throne. In doing so, he had written his own code. Survival justified anything. His empire was not built on loyalty or respect, but on the belief that no one dared strike first. That belief carried him far. It made him boss, made him a legend, made him the feared hand of Murder Incorporated. But it also sealed his fate. Because when your power rests only on fear, the day someone stops fearing you is the day your empire dies. His story is littered with contradictions. He was the immigrant dock worker who clawed his way to the top of New York's underworld, a man who turned rage into authority. He was the soldier who once wore the uniform of the United States Army, only to return to the streets as one of its most infamous killers. He was the executioner who believed loyalty could be bought with violence, even as betrayal gathered around him like smoke. Those who knew him spoke of his unpredictable rages. Men could die for a minor insult, for a misplaced word, for crossing him in ways too small to matter to anyone else. His power was absolute, but it was also fragile. A man feared that absolutely is never truly trusted. Even his allies looked at him with unease, wondering when his temper might turn on them. Fear commands silence, but silence is not the same as loyalty. His violent legacy reached far beyond his own reign. Murder Incorporated, the execution arm of the national syndicate, had reshaped the Mafia. It had turned killing into business, murder into policy, blood into bureaucracy. Albert oversaw it, sanctioned it, lived it. Hundreds of men were erased in those years, their lives snuffed out as casually as debts collected. It was efficiency masked as brutality, a system that made the Mafia both terrifying and strangely modern. And when the world whispered about the Lord High Executioner, it was this role that echoed the loudest. But brutality carries its own price. Albert's temper made him infamous, but it also made him reckless. He ruled like a storm, loud, destructive, impossible to ignore. And storms draw attention. The press seized on his name, turning him into a symbol of mob violence. Law enforcement targeted him, their files thick with unsolved murders linked to his shadow. Politicians demanded action, spurred by headlines that painted him as the face of organized crime. In the end, the attention he drew became more dangerous than any rival. Yet his fall was not just the work of newspapers or detectives. It came from within. Carlo Gambino, quiet and patient, watched his every outburst, every mistake. Vito Genovese, ambitious and relentless, plotted his rise. Together, they saw in Albert not just a rival, but a liability. And in the Mafia, liabilities are not tolerated. The same fear that had once been his shield became the justification for his elimination. His own legend condemned him. When the bullets tore through him in that Manhattan barber shop, it was not just a man who died. It was the end of an era. The Lord High Executioner represented a style of rule rooted in open violence, in chaos disguised as control. His successors learned from his mistakes. Gambino ruled differently, quiet, calculated, invisible. Where Albert had shouted, Gambino whispered. Where Albert had killed to command fear, Gambino built empires on patience. In many ways, the modern Mafia was shaped less by Albert's reign than by the reaction to it. He showed them what not to be. Still, his legacy lingers. Every story told in hushed tones about his temper, every headline that branded him ruthless, every body tied to Murder Incorporated, they all left a scar on the Mafia's history. He remains a cautionary tale, proof that power built only on blood eventually ends in blood. Proof that fear, while potent, is not indestructible. Proof that the executioner himself is never immune from execution. For the men who lived through his reign, Albert's death must have carried both relief and dread. Relief, because his volatility was gone, replaced by the steadier hand of Gambino. Dread, because his assassination proved the fragility of every throne. If Anastasia could be killed in daylight, then anyone could. The barbershop floor did not just mark his end. It marked the realization that no man in the Mafia was untouchable. And what of Albert himself? Did he sense it in those final days, the silence gathering around him, the betrayal creeping closer? Did he know that his empire was crumbling beneath him, even as he sat in that chair with a towel tucked under his chin? Or did he believe, until the final second, that his name alone was enough to keep the bullets at bay? We will never know. What we do know is this. Albert Anastasia left behind a legacy carved into history with violence. He rose through murder, ruled through fear, and fell through betrayal. His empire, like the blood on that barber's floor, could not be scrubbed clean. And as the years passed, the Mafia carried his ghost with them, not as inspiration, but as warning. The Lord High Executioner had built his kingdom on death, and in the end, death came back to claim it.